Hey there, and welcome back. However heavy this day has been, you are allowed to put it down now, the whole of it, and let the dark gather gently at the edges of the room, and let your mind go quiet and begin to wander. Nothing is asked of you tonight, but to soften your breathing. Let the warmth of the bed take your weight, and come with me a long way back, 500 years and more, to the life of a woman cradled at the very centre of England's royal house. Our tale tonight is that of a king's daughter, a princess of the line of York, born within palace walls and reared to serve as a counter in the great game of thrones. Her hand pledged and unpledged, and pledged once more as the needs of kings required. She was sister to a queen, niece to two kings, granddaughter of a duchess, and one of the most marriageable young women in all of Europe. Her marriage a matter of treaties and politics from the time she was a small child. And yet the most remarkable thing this woman ever did was the one thing she was never supposed to do. Late in her life, with her royal blood and her high connections, she set all of it aside and married, for no reason but love. A country gentleman of no rank at all, and paid for that love with disgrace and exile from the court that had been her whole world. Her name was Cecily of York, and we are bound tonight toward a single hour, far into the quiet of the night, when this princess of the blood will face the man who had wed her sister and tell him plainly what she has done. And watch the colour change in his face, and know that for the sake of one Lincolnshire squire, she has flung away everything a princess was taught to prize. Whether she ever regretted it is one of the quiet questions of her story. All of that, though, is still far off in the dark hours to come. There is a whole life to pass through before we reach it, and we begin at the beginning. Before we cross over into her century, there is a single thing I will ask of you. It is a quiet comfort to me to know who has chosen to sit with me through the dark tonight. So if you are so moved, set down a line or two below to let me know what part of the world holds you this evening and how deep the night has grown where you lie. I look through the notes that come, everyone, and there is a soft gladness in the thought of so many scattered, darkened rooms. Each one hushed and waiting, each given over for an hour to the same old story as the night settles in. And if these slow walks through a world long vanished are something you would care to seek out again, the way to do so is simply to subscribe, for whatever moment the wish arrives, offered softly and never pressed. And another of these gentle evenings will reach you at the right hour. That is everything I wish to say. From this point on, the night is given over to her. Picture this, a grand palace beside a slow grey river, in the very heart of the city of London, one spring day in 1469. This is the Palace of Westminster, the chief residence of the Kings of England. A sprawling complex of halls and chambers and chapels along the banks of the Thames, and within its walls, in a richly hung chamber, the King and Queen of England have just been given another daughter. Her father is Edward, fourth of that name, the tall and golden king of the House of York, who won his crown on the battlefield and holds it still by the force of his own bright personality. Her mother is Elizabeth, the beautiful and controversial queen, a woman of no royal blood whom the king married for love to the scandal of his court. Born to them this spring is a third daughter, and they give her the name Cecily, after the king's formidable mother, the old Duchess of York. She is, from the moment of her birth, a princess of England, a piece of great value on the marriage board of Europe, and her parents will spend her childhood weighing offers for her hand from the courts of kings. Neither parent could guess, looking down at the small sleeping face, what this daughter's life would hold, that she would be named a bastard and then made royal again, pledged to princes and wed to a man of no rank, lifted to the summit of the court and then dropped into a quiet obscurity, and that she would close her days not as the queen she might so easily have become, but as the wife of an ordinary country gentleman, having chosen love above every advantage her royal birth had laid before her. But none of that has happened yet, and all of it lies hidden in the time to come. For now there is only a newborn in a riverside palace, a king's youngest girl, and the long turning path of her life waits ahead of her, not yet begun. The England she opened her eyes upon was a country of rivers, and the House of York lived along the water as naturally as the swans did. The palace of her birth stood on the north bank of the Thames at Westminster, where the High Hall and the Abbey and the warren of royal lodgings crowded down almost to the tide line. And from her earliest days, the river was the road she travelled. A king's children were not kept in one place. They were carried up and down the Thames by barge between the riverside houses that the crown kept ready for them, and the names of those houses would have been among the first words she learned. Sheen, that her father loved, set in its green loop of water upstream. Greenwich below the city, where the air came fresher off the widening estuary, and above all Eltham, in the high wooded country of Kent, where the royal nursery was most often kept. A moated manor reached by a long stone bridge, snug among its parks and ponds. To be rowed down river on a bright morning, wrapped against the wind, past the wharves and the watermen and the looming bulk of the bridge, with its houses piled along it, was the ordinary business of her infancy. And the sound of oars and the smell of the tide line must have lived in her senses long before she could name them. The nursery she was reared in was itself a small kingdom, an establishment of its own with its officers and servants, set apart from the bustle of the adult court, so that the royal children might be raised in cleaner air and greater safety. A king's daughter did not lie in her mother's arms through the night. She was given over, almost from birth, to a household of women appointed to her care, chief among them a wet nurse to feed her, and a body of rockers and chamberers to tend her cradle and her growing, all of it watched over by a lady of rank, who governed the nursery as a steward governs a house. The woman who suckled the infant Cecily is even known to us by name, a gentlewoman called Isabel Stedolph, wife to one of the Queen's own servants, and there is something to be marked in that small fact, that the milk by which a princess of England grew was given by a particular living woman, with a name and a husband and a place in the world, one of the many half-seen people who carried the highborn through their helpless years and were forgotten by the histories almost as soon as their service was done. The rooms those children grew in were warm and richly furnished, for nothing was stinted on the heirs and daughters of the king. The cradles were hung with cloth of gold and edged with fur and ermine, the little chambers warmed by braziers and broad fires of wood, the floors strewn with fresh rushes and sweet herbs against the damp. The walls hung with painted cloths and tapestries to keep out the cold of stone. There was a chapel close at hand, for the religion of the household ran through every hour of the day, and there were physicians and apothecaries kept ready. For the abiding fear that hung over every nursery in that age was the fear of childhood sickness, which carried off the children of kings as readily as the children of the poor. Cecily was tended like a precious thing, and so she was, in the cold accounting of her father's policy, a daughter to be kept safe and whole until the day she could be spent upon a marriage. But she was tended, too, with the ordinary human warmth that gathers about a baby, by the women whose whole work was the keeping of her, and whatever else her strange life would bring, it began in plenty and in care. Beyond the nursery walls lay the parks, and as she left her cradle behind and grew into a child who could walk and ride, the green world of those royal manors became the country of her play. Eltham had its hunting park and its gardens, Sheen its riverside walks, Greenwich its broad reach of the Thames, where the ships of the world came up toward London. The royal children were taught early to sit a horse and to know the names of hawks and hounds, for the chase was the chief sport and exercise of their class, and a princess was expected to ride well and to take her place in the field. There would have been small ponies for the little ones, and tumbling dogs underfoot, and long days out of doors in the summer when the court was on its travels, moving from house to house as the cleaning of one and the airing of another required. A royal court in that age did not stay put. It journeyed, eating its way through the stores of one manor and then removing to the next, and the children went with it or were sent ahead. So that Cecily's childhood was a thing of constant motion, of packing and barges and new chambers, of arriving and departing, until the turning of the seasons through a string of beautiful houses was simply the shape that the world had. It was, by any measure, a fortunate beginning, and it is worth dwelling on the plenty of it before the storms come, for the contrast is the whole of her story. Here was a child set down at the very heart of the richest household in England, fed and clothed and warmed and guarded with a care that few in that hard age could dream of, carried in barges between palaces, reared among parks and gardens and the soft luxuries of the royal nursery. Whatever shadows lay over her father's throne, they did not fall across the cradle. The danger was real, but it was kept, for now, beyond the moat and the park wall, and the small Cecily knew nothing of it. She knew the warmth of the fire and the faces of her nurses, the motion of the river and the smell of the rushes, the warm enveloping world of a princess's infancy in which every need was met before it was felt. It is the brightness of this dawn that makes the later darkness so sharp, for the woman who would end her days cast out and disgraced, the wife of a country squire in a quiet house far from any throne, began as one of the most cherished children in the kingdom, with the whole green wealth of England's royal manors laid out around her cradle like a promise that nothing would ever be taken away. The world into which Cecily was born was a glittering one, but it was also a dangerous one, and the danger lay very close beneath the glitter. Her father, King Edward, had won his crown in battle only 8 years before, and he held it still in the teeth of enemies who had not given up. The old quarrel that had torn England apart, the long war between the rival branches of the royal family, was not over. It merely slept, and it would wake again and again throughout Cecily's childhood, sending her father into exile and her mother into hiding more than once. Even in the year of Cecily's birth, the storm was gathering, for the king's mightiest subject, the great earl who had helped to make him, was turning against him. And within months of the princess's first spring, the realm would be plunged once more into rebellion and war. So she came into the world in a lull between storms, a brief calm that would not last. The daughter of a king whose throne was far less secure than the splendour of his court suggested. It was the common condition of her family, this living always on the edge of catastrophe, and Cecily would know it all her life. The sense that everything might be swept away at any moment, that no height was safe and no fortune certain. She was a princess. Yes, and surrounded by every luxury her father's court could provide. But she was a princess of a house that had to fight for its crown, and the fighting was not done. There comes a point in every privileged childhood when the cradle is left behind, and the long work of making a lady begins. And for Cecily, that work started in earnest, once her father was firmly restored to his throne, and the household could settle into its proper round. The education of a king's daughter was not the education of a scholar, it was the shaping of an instrument. The careful fitting of a girl for the life she was destined to lead as the wife of some prince, in some court not yet chosen. What such a girl was taught, she was taught against the day of her marriage, and every accomplishment laid upon her had its use in the making of a queen consort. She learned, first of all, to carry herself, to stand and to walk, and to sit as befitted her rank, to enter a room and to leave it, to govern her face and her hands, to move through the endless ceremony of courtly life with an ease that looked like nature and was in truth the fruit of long drilling. Deportment was the foundation of it all, for a princess was forever on display, and the carriage of her body was the first language she would speak in any court she came to. She was taught to read, and here we are granted one of those rare shafts of light that fall, now and then, across the hidden inner life of a medieval girl. Cecily and her elder sister Elizabeth were schooled together, the two of them close in age and closer in affection, and they shared their books as sisters do. And by rare good fortune, two of those books survive with their childish ownership marks still upon the page. In a French manuscript of the old romance of the Holy Grail, the two girls wrote their names in their own hands, Elizabeth and then Cecily, each adding after her name the proud plain words that she was the king's daughter. And in another volume, a book of Eastern adventures, the sisters signed the title page together. It is a small thing and an enormous one. Across 5 centuries we can see the two of them bent over the same page, the future Queen of England and the future country gentlewoman, sharing the same stories, writing their names side by side in the way of girls who love each other and love their books. Cecily's hand, the record dryly notes, was not a fine one. Her writing was reckoned poor. But she could read, in English and in French, and she and her sister read together, and somewhere in that shared reading lay one of the warmest threads of her whole life, the bond with Elizabeth that would hold through every storm to come. French she learned, but not Latin, for the learned tongue of the church and the scholars was not thought needful in a girl who would never say the Mass nor argue in the schools. French was the language of courts and of romance, the speech a noble lady might need in any of the realms of Christendom, and so the daughters of Edward were schooled in that tongue and left without the Latin their brothers conned. Beyond their letters they were taught the arts that adorned a noble woman, to sing and to play upon the instruments of the chamber, the lute and the clavichord and the soft-voiced strings that filled the private hours of the court. To dance the stately measures and the livelier rounds, for dancing was both a pleasure and a duty, a thing performed before the whole assembled court on the high feast days, and to ply the needle, that endless companion of women's lives, working in coloured silks and threads of gold at the embroideries that filled the long indoor hours and clothed the altars and the canopied beds in their splendour. These were not idle ornaments. They were the working skills of the station. Cecily was born to the things a princess must be able to do, and she was drilled in them year upon year until they were as natural to her as breathing. And running beneath all of it, the deepest current of her schooling, was religion. The day of a royal child was framed by prayer from waking to sleeping, the round of devotions as fixed and familiar as the meals, the orisons at rising, the hearing of Mass, the grace at table, the devotions at night, the keeping of the fasts and the feasts and the saints' days that marked out the turning year. A noble woman was expected to be devout, and the forms of that devotion were taught from infancy, the prayers learned by heart, the beads told, the proper observances kept. For Cecily, this early grounding in the faith would prove no mere formality, for there would come a year of her girlhood when she and her mother and sisters fled for their lives to the protection of holy ground. And the church that had framed her childhood prayers became the very wall between her family and destruction. But that lay ahead. In these years, religion was simply the air of the household, the rhythm that ordered every day, as much a part of her making as the deportment and the dancing and the long hours at the needle. She was, by the one description that reaches us, a fair girl, comely as her famously beautiful mother had been, and growing toward a young womanhood that the courts of Europe were already weighing. We should not imagine her bent always over a book or a frame of embroidery. The life of the royal children had its freedoms and its pleasures, its games and its riding and its long summer days, its festivals and its petting by the great. But threaded through all the play and the plenty was this steady, patient shaping, the making of a princess, fit to be a queen, and Cecily submitted to it as every girl of her rank submitted, learning her lessons and her graces and her prayers, becoming, year by careful year, exactly the polished and accomplished and marriageable creature her birth required her to be, with no notion yet that the elaborate destiny she was being fitted for would be snatched away before she could ever fulfill it. The strangeness of growing up in such a world is worth a moment of our thought, for it shaped everything that Cecily would become. A child born into an ordinary family grows up with the assumption that the world is, on the whole, stable, that the walls of home will stand, that the people around them will remain. A child born into the House of York in those years could assume none of these things. The throne her father sat on had been won by the sword and might be lost the same way. The great men who bowed at court today might be in arms against the king tomorrow. The very walls of the palace offered no certain safety. For more than once the family had been forced to flee them in the dead of night. She learned, almost before she could have put it into words, that fortune was a wheel forever turning, that the highest might be cast down in an afternoon and the proud reduced to fugitives, that nothing in this world was promised or secure. It was a hard lesson for a child, and it would be driven home again and again as she grew, until it became part of the very grain of her character. Some who learn such lessons are broken by them, taught only fear. Others are toughened, taught a kind of wary resilience, a capacity to endure whatever comes and to keep their feet, however the ground shifts beneath them. Cecily, by the evidence of her later life, was of the second kind. The instability of her childhood did not crush her. It tempered her, gave her the strength she would need to survive the storms still ahead, and perhaps, in the end, the boldness to make the one great choice that was entirely her own. Her mother was a woman who knew, better than most, how quickly fortune could turn. For Elizabeth had risen higher than any Englishwoman of her rank had ever dreamed of rising, and had made bitter enemies in the rising. She had been a widow of modest birth when the young king fell in love with her and married her in secret, and the marriage had scandalized the court and enraged the great lords, who had expected their king to make a grand foreign match. Worse, the new queen had a large family of brothers and sisters, and the king advanced them all, marrying them into the greatest families in the land, heaping honours and offices upon them, until the old nobility seethed with resentment at the upstart, Woodvilles who had climbed so high so fast. This resentment would poison the politics of the reign, and would, in time, prove deadly to Cecily's own family. But in her early childhood, it was simply the air she breathed, the ordinary texture of life at her father's court, the splendour and the rivalry, the king's bright magnificence and the dark currents of jealousy that ran beneath it. She grew up amid all of this, one of a growing brood of young princes and princesses, watched over by her formidable mother and surrounded by the Woodville relations, whose fortunes were bound up so tightly with her own. Her mother is worth dwelling on, for Elizabeth was a remarkable woman, and her example cannot have been lost on her watchful daughter. She had begun life as a commoner, the daughter of a knight and a foreign noblewoman, and had married young, only to be left a widow with 2 small sons while still in her 20s. By the ordinary reckoning of the world, her prospects then were modest enough. A young widow of no great fortune did not expect to rise far. And yet she had caught the eye of a king, and held it, and become his wife and queen against all the opposition of his court, the most spectacular marriage of the age. Whatever else one might say of her, Elizabeth had known how to seize the chance that fortune offered her, and to turn it to the highest possible advantage. She was beautiful, certainly, but beauty alone does not explain her rise. She was also shrewd, determined, and ambitious. A woman who knew her own mind, and pursued her own interests, and those of her family, with unrelenting energy. From such a mother, the girl would have learned much, how a woman might exercise power in a world that gave women little, how to endure reversal and wait for opportunity, how to fight for one's own. And she would have learned too, watching the hatred that her mother's rise provoked, the cost of climbing high, the resentment that follows those who reach above their station. It was a complicated inheritance, this example of a mother who had risen so far and made so many enemies in the rising, and it must have shaped the daughter in ways we can only guess at. Behind the bright young mother, whose rise had so scandalized the court, stood another woman altogether, older and harder and more formidable still, and it was after this grandmother that Cecily was named. Cecily Neville, Duchess of York, the mother of the king, was a grand lady of the old blood in a way the queen could never be, sprung from the mightiest noble house of the age. Sister and aunt and cousin to half the lords of England. She had been a famous beauty in her youth, called the Rose of Raby after the northern castle where she was born, and she had been proud enough in her prime to be nicknamed Proud Cis. But the years had laid a heavy hand upon her, for she had given her sons to the wars and seen them spent. Her husband, the Duke, whose claim to the throne had begun the whole long quarrel, had been killed in battle and his head set up in mockery on the walls of York with a paper crown upon it. One son had died beside him, and from that ruin she had seen another son, Cecily's father, rise up to seize the very crown his father had died reaching for, so that the widow of a slain pretender became the mother of a reigning king. Few women of that age had drunk so deep of both triumph and disaster, and the old Duchess carried both in her bearing. A matriarch of iron, whose long life had taught her exactly how high a family might climb and how far it might fall. To be named for such a woman was to be marked in a quiet way as a daughter of the true royal stock, the Neville and the Plantagenet blood that the king's own marriage had so notably failed to bring him. The little Cecily would have known her grandmother as a presence of weight and dignity, a figure to be reverenced, the head of the family, in a way that even the king deferred to. The old Duchess kept a household of almost religious strictness, her days ordered like a nun's around prayer and reading and devout works, and she would in her last years withdraw almost wholly into a life of piety at her castle of Berkhamsted. A proud lady turned almost holy woman, ruling her own small world by the clock of the church. From her, and from the formidable queen, her mother Cecily had before her two patterns of how a woman might wield power in a world built to deny it to women, the one through beauty and ambition and the seizing of fortune's chance, the other through blood and endurance and the long authority of a survivor. Both women had risen high and suffered much. Both had learned to bend before the storms of that violent age and to keep their feet when others fell. It was a powerful inheritance for a watchful girl, this example of two strong women at the head of her family. And we may guess that something of their steel passed into the granddaughter who carried the old Duchess's name. The wider family that gathered about the throne in those years was a vast and tangled thing, and Cecily grew up in the thick of it, surrounded by relations of every degree. On her mother's side were the Woodvilles, that teeming brood of uncles and aunts, whom the king had married so advantageously into the first families of the land. A connection so large and so swiftly advanced that it had become a byword for upstart ambition and drawn upon itself the hatred of the older nobility. On her father's side stood the Nevilles and the Plantagenets, the high and ancient houses of the realm, including the two royal uncles whose names would echo so terribly through her later life. George, the unstable brother whose treasons would bring him at last to a traitor's death within the Tower, and Richard, the loyal younger brother in whom the king reposed such trust, and who would one day prove the destroyer of his brother's children. But all of that was hidden in the years ahead. To the child Cecily, these were simply her uncles, the towering men of the family, figures of the adult world that wheeled above the nursery, and she could no more have read their futures than she could have read her own. It is one of the strange cruelties of her story that the very people among whom she was raised, the family that should have been her surest shelter, would prove the agents of her family's ruin. The House of York destroyed itself from within. Its wounds were dealt by its own hands. The kinsman who would seize the throne and brand her a bastard was no foreign enemy, but her own father's brother, a man she had known all her life, who had sat at the same feasts and stood as kin at the same christenings. The poison that would one day burst out and tear the family apart was already there, in those golden years running beneath the surface of the bright gatherings, in the jealousies between the Queen's kin and the old nobility, in the restless ambition of the King's brothers. The child moving among her relations at the feast, petted and admired, the King's fair daughter named for the proud old Duchess, was already surrounded by the people who would unmake her, though neither she nor they yet knew it. The family was her world and her warmth, and the family would be her undoing. And both of these things were true together in the bright years before the fall. There were a great many of those young ones, for Edward and Elizabeth were blessed with a large family, and Cecily grew up in a nursery full of brothers and sisters. The eldest was Elizabeth, the firstborn, who would one day be Queen of England and to whom Cecily would be close all her life. Then came Mary, and then Cecily herself, and after her a whole succession of others. The boys who would be lords of the realm, and the girls who would be married off to seal alliances. Two brothers in particular would carry the hopes of the dynasty: Edward, the eldest son and heir, born when she was still very young, and Richard, the second son, born a few years later. These two boys were the future of the House of York, the sons who would carry the line forward, and their births were occasions of great rejoicing. No one then could have dreamed of the fate that awaited those two small boys, the most famous and most pitied children in all of English history. But that horror lay in the future. For now they were simply Cecily's little brothers, the princes of the nursery, and she grew up alongside them in the golden years of her father's reign, a princess among the royal children, in a court that seemed, for a while, to have weathered its storms and come at last into calm waters. Of all the bonds that ran through Cecily's life, the deepest and the longest were the bonds with her sisters. For the daughters of Edward IV were a band of their own, raised together, sheltered together, married off one by one as the years required, and bound by an affection that the worst of times could not break. They were a numerous tribe of girls. The eldest was Elizabeth, born 3 years before Cecily, the firstborn of the whole family, and the one who would climb highest of them all. Then came Mary, the second daughter, then Cecily herself, and after them, as the years went on, a further string of sisters, Anne and Catherine, and the youngest, Bridget, who would be given to the church and end her days a nun. Brothers came among them, the precious sons on whom the dynasty's hopes were fixed, but it was the sisters who formed the close inner world of Cecily's girlhood, the companions of her nursery and her schoolroom and her play, the faces she woke to and slept beside through all the years of her growing. Closest of all, from the very first, was Elizabeth, the eldest. The two were near in age and nearer in heart, schooled together over the same books, signing their names together on the same pages, sharing the long indoor hours and the long summer days of a shared childhood. It was a friendship that would have to weather extraordinary strains, for the wheel of fortune would lift Elizabeth to the throne itself, Queen of England and mother of a new royal line, while it cast her down at the last into disgrace and obscurity. And yet through all the dizzying changes of their fortunes, the affection between the two sisters held. When Cecily was a bastard and a fugitive, Elizabeth was a bastard and a fugitive beside her. When Elizabeth was raised to be queen, she kept her sister close about her at the court, and even at the end, when Cecily's defiant marriage had put her beyond the pale of royal favour, it was to Elizabeth that she would have turned for what comfort and shelter a sister could still give. The line that ran from the two little girls signing their books to the Queen and the disgraced widow of their later years was a single unbroken thread of love. And it is among the truest things we know of either of them. But not all the sisters were granted the long lives that Elizabeth and Cecily would have. Mary, the second daughter, the sister who stood next above Cecily in the family's order, died young, carried off in her girlhood, while she was herself only a child of some 13 years, before the catastrophes of their family had even begun. We know little of Mary beyond her dates and her place in the line, but her early death is a reminder of the constant nearness of mortality, even in the most cosseted of households. The way that death moved freely through the nurseries of the highborn and took the children of kings as readily as any others. For the young princess, the loss of the sister just above her must have been an early and bitter lesson in the fragility of the bright world she lived in. A first crack in the golden surface. A first of the many partings that her long life of partings would bring. The band of sisters was a strong and loving company, but it was not proof against the common griefs of the age, and Mary's empty place among them was the first shadow to fall across that bright sorority. There survives, by a happy chance, an image of these royal children gathered together, set in coloured glass, that lets us see them ranked side by side as their own age saw them. In a tall window, given to a cathedral church in their father's reign, the whole family was shown at prayer. The king and the queen kneeling at their desks, and behind each parent, the row of their children, the sons behind the father, the daughters behind the mother, each small figure, crowned and robed and labelled with a name. There, among her sisters, knelt Cecily, one glazed princess in a row of jewelled princesses, the daughters of York, lined up in their jewelled gowns, with their hands joined in prayer, a family portrait in light. The window was made in the golden years before the storm, and it froze the family forever in their moment of greatest fortune. The king and queen and all their children gathered in their glory, as though nothing could ever come to scatter them. Within a few years of its making, the king at his desk would be dead. The two little sons behind him would have vanished into the tower, and the kneeling daughters would be scattered to sanctuary and disgrace, and the long uncertain business of survival. But in the glass they kneel together still, the whole bright family, and Cecily kneels among her sisters, caught in the one moment before the fall, in the company of women, that was the warmest thing her life would ever hold. The court she grew up in was a place of genuine splendour, for her father loved magnificence and had the means to indulge it. The halls of the royal palaces glowed with colour in those years. The walls hung with rich tapestries, worked in wool and silk and thread of gold. The tables laid with silver and gilt plate that caught the light of 100 candles. Her father, dressed in the most sumptuous fashions of the age, in velvets and furs and cloth of gold, and he expected his court to match him, so that the great chambers were forever filled with lords and ladies in their finest. A moving tapestry of crimson and azure and emerald. There was music everywhere, the soft sound of lutes and harps in the private chambers, the bright fanfares of trumpets at the great feasts. There were entertainments without end, jousts and tournaments where armoured knights thundered at one another, in the lists, masks and disguisings, where the courtiers dressed as gods and heroes, dancing that went on late into the candlelit nights. To grow up in such a place was to take splendour for granted, to assume that the world was made of silk and jewels and music, and Cecily, in her earliest years, knew nothing else. It was a charmed existence, the childhood of a princess in the most glittering court England had seen in living memory, and if there were dark currents beneath the surface, a child need not have noticed them. Caught up in the colour and the warmth and the endless ceremony of her father's dazzling reign. To understand the world that shaped her, we must look at the turning year of her father's court, for the royal household lived by a calendar of festival and ceremony, and the high days of that calendar were the brightest hours of Cecily's childhood. The year was a wheel of observances, the seasons marked not by dates upon a page, but by the keeping of the church's feasts, and the greatest of them all was the long celebration of Christmas. The 12 days of midwinter revelry that lit up the darkest stretch of the year. When the cold closed in and the days drew short, the court gathered in one of the greater houses and gave itself over to weeks of feasting and play, the halls blazing with light and warmth against the dark outside, the tables heaped with the rich foods of the season, the fires roaring on the hearths while the wind beat at the shutters. For a child, it must have been a time of pure wonder, the gloom of winter banished by the glow of 1,000 candles, the household swollen with guests, the days given over to pleasure. The feasts of those 12 days were spectacles in themselves. The meat brought in to the sound of trumpets, the boar's head carried shoulder high through the hall, the subtleties of moulded sugar and marzipan shaped into castles and beasts and set before the king to be marvelled at before they were eaten. There was wine in plenty and spiced ale, and the warm, sweet smell of it filling the hall, and music without cease. The minstrels in their gallery playing through the long candlelit evenings while the court ate and drank and watched the entertainments. For the high feast was not only eating, it was display, the household putting on its glory, every lord and lady in their richest array. The whole company, a moving brilliance of velvet and fur and jewels under the blaze of the lights. To be a child set down in the midst of such a scene, lifted perhaps to see over the heads of the throng, dazzled by the colour and the noise and the warmth, was to take in, without knowing it, the very grammar of royal magnificence, the lesson that power expressed itself in splendour, and that her own family stood at the dazzling centre of it all. Best of all, for the young, were the disguisings and the mummings, the costumed revels that were the chief delight of the season. On the chief nights, the hall would be given over to spectacle. Courtiers masked and robed as gods and heroes and strange figures out of legend. Pageant cars wheeled in bearing castles, or ships, or gardens, all worked in painted cloth and gilding. Dances performed by torchlight in fantastical array. The boldest and brightest of these revels crowned the 12 days at their close, on the feast of the Epiphany, the 12th night that ended the Christmas season, in a final blaze of misrule and wonder. A child watching from among the household would have seen the familiar faces of the court transformed into a moving dream. The everyday people of her world remade for a night into the figures of romance, and the memory of such nights, the music and the masks and the leaping torchlight must have lodged deep in her, a vision of beauty that the grey later years could never quite take from her. Beyond the midwinter revels, the year had its other peaks. There was the high solemnity of Easter, the court keeping the long fast of Lent, and then breaking it in the joy of the resurrection, the spring feast of St. George, patron of England and of the noble order of the Garter that her father so loved, with its processions of robed knights in their blue mantles and its splendid ceremonies, the bright summer days of progress, when the court took to the roads and the rivers and showed itself to the country, and threaded through the whole year were the family occasions of the family itself, the christenings and the churchings and the marriages, each one an excuse for ceremony and feasting, each one a chance for the House of York to put on its magnificence before the world. Cecily grew up inside this perpetual theatre, this endless round of splendid observance, and it taught her, more deeply than any lesson at the schoolroom, who she was and what her family was, and what was owed to royal blood. It is worth holding this brilliance in the mind, for it is the measure against which everything later must be set. The girl who would one day keep house with a country squire, who would pass her last years in a quiet far from any throne, was reared in the most magnificent court that England had seen for generations, amid a splendour so habitual that she can hardly have imagined any other way of living. The blaze of the Christmas hall, the masked revels of Twelfth Night, the robed knights of the Garter, the heaped tables and the music and the moving brilliance of the court at its feasts. All of this was simply the world to her, the ordinary furniture of a royal childhood. That she would live to lose it, to set it aside with her own hands for the sake of a love that the world thought beneath her, is the central turn of her story. And the splendour of her beginning is what gives that turning its weight. She knew exactly what she would be giving up, for she had been raised in the very heart of it, and she gave it up all the same. From the time she was very small, Cecily's hand was a matter of high politics, for the daughter of a king was a prize to be offered in the great game of alliances by which the realms of that age bound themselves together and pursued their quarrels. While she was still a child, her father set about finding her a husband worthy of her rank, and his eye fell upon the north, upon the old enemy beyond the border, the kingdom of Scotland. For generations the two realms had warred and raided and made uneasy peace, and a marriage between the two royal houses might, it was hoped, settle the long enmity at last. So a match was arranged between Cecily and the heir to the northern throne, the boy who would one day be King of Scots, and for a time the little princess was promised to her northern prince, her future seemingly settled, her destiny to be a queen across the border. She was, by this arrangement, to leave England in time and go north to a foreign court, to learn its ways and become its queen. And a portion of her dowry was even paid over in advance, instalment by instalment, as the treaty required. For years, this was Cecily's expected future, the path laid out before her, a Scottish marriage, a Scottish crown, a life spent in that cold country as the wife of its king. But the path would not hold, for the friendship between the two kingdoms was a fragile thing, and the politics that had made the match could as easily unmake it. It is worth pausing to see how such a betrothal was actually made, for the marriage of a princess was a piece of high statecraft, conducted with all the solemnity of a treaty between realms. And Cecily was pledged to her Scottish prince with a ceremony and a paperwork that belied her tender years. She was a girl of 5 when the match was struck, in the autumn of 1474, the heir of Scotland, not much older. The two of them children who had never met and would be bound across a border by the pens of grown men. The thing was done by embassy. Envoys of the Scottish king rode south to treat with her father, and the terms were hammered out as terms always were, the size of her dowry, the manner and timing of its payment, the rank and provision she should have as a future Queen of Scots. Every clause weighed and bargained as though she were a province to be ceded, rather than a small girl in a nursery. When the bargain was sealed, it was sealed in form, and the little princess was a wife, in promise to a boy beyond the hills. The dowry was the heart of such an arrangement, the price a father paid to place his daughter on a throne, and Cecily's was set high, as befitted the daughter of the King of England. It was not handed over in a single chest of gold. It was promised in instalments, year by year, paid over to the Scottish crown in token of good faith while the children grew toward the age of marriage. And so, through the years of her girlhood, sums of English money travelled north across the border in her name, the gold of her dowry going on ahead of her like a herald, binding the two kingdoms in coin before they were bound in blood. There is something almost poignant in that slow northward trickle of her marriage portion, the treaty being honoured payment by payment, while the girl it concerned played in the parks of Kent, knowing perhaps that she was promised away, but knowing nothing yet of the man, the country, the cold throne that the gold was buying for her. For this was the plain truth of what the betrothal meant, that Cecily was being raised for export, fitted out to be sent away. A royal daughter married abroad did not visit home. She left it, often forever, crossing into a foreign realm to become its queen and to spend the rest of her life among a strange people, speaking, learning, ruling in their tongue. The friendship of England and Scotland had been bought and sold across that border for generations, the two kingdoms forever raiding and warring and patching up uneasy truces, and a marriage between the royal houses was the surest seal that statesmen knew. A living bond of flesh to hold two crowns at peace. Cecily was to be that bond. She was being prepared, in all the years of her schooling, for a destiny in the north, a crossing of the border as a young bride, a wedding in some grey Scottish church, a queenship at Edinburgh or Stirling among the lords of that hard kingdom, a life given wholly to the keeping of a peace, decided when she was too young to understand it. Her French and her music and her needlework, her deportment and her devotions, all of it was the dressing of a future Queen of Scots. We do well to picture for a moment the weight of such a future settling upon a child. Somewhere in the years of her growing, Cecily must have come to understand what was meant for her, that she would not stay among her sisters in the green country of her birth, but would be taken from it, set upon a horse or a ship, and carried off to a colder land to live and die a stranger's wife. Other girls of the court faced their own arranged marriages, but few faced exile, and fewer still the lonely eminence of a foreign throne. Whether the prospect frightened her or fired her, we cannot know, for no word of her feeling survives, but it is no great stretch to imagine the mixture of pride and dread that such a destiny might wake in a thoughtful girl. The knowledge that she was marked for high things, and the knowledge, just beneath it, that those high things would cost her everyone and everything she had ever known. This was the price of royal blood in a daughter, and Cecily was being asked, year by year, to make ready to pay it. And all of it, in the end, would rest upon nothing more solid than the goodwill of the moment. For the friendship between the two crowns was a fragile and a shifting thing, made and unmade with the seasons. And the careful structure of treaty and dowry and promise that bound Cecily to her northern prince could be undone as readily as it had been built. That undoing, when it came, would teach her early the lesson she would carry to the end, that nothing arranged by kings was ever truly secure, that the highest destiny could be written for a girl and then erased between one season and the next, and that her own wishes counted for nothing in either the writing or the erasing. She was a child, still, promised and prepared, and pointed north toward a throne. And the throne would melt away before her like mist, as we shall see, leaving her once more only what she had always been beneath the treaties, an unwed king's daughter, waiting to learn to what new purpose her hand would next be turned. We might pause here to imagine what that promised future would have meant, for it was a real path her life might have taken, and it ran in quite another direction from the one she finally walked. Had the first match held, Cecily would have gone north as a girl, crossed the border into a colder and wilder country, and become in time the Queen of Scotland, mistress of a court at Edinburgh or Stirling. Far from the green south of her birth, she would have learned the ways of a foreign people, raised her children as Scots, perhaps never seen England again, but on rare embassies of state. It was the destiny of many a royal daughter, this sending away to a distant throne, to live out one's life among strangers for the sake of a treaty signed when one was a child. Some such brides found contentment in their new lands, others pined for home until they died. Which Cecily would have been we cannot know, for the path closed before she could walk it. But it is worth holding in mind. This Queen of Scots she never became, for it reminds us how many lives a person of her rank might have led, how her fate hung always on the shifting calculations of men who saw her not as a girl with feelings and wishes of her own, but as a piece to be played, a card to be held or discarded as the game required. The Scottish crown was held out to her and then withdrawn, and she was a child throughout, with no more part in the deciding than the youngest page at her father's court. And so it proved. The peace between England and Scotland soured, as it always did, and the marriage that was to have sealed it fell apart with it. Relations between the two kingdoms broke down into open hostility, and Cecily's father, far from sending his daughter north to marry the Scottish heir, found himself once more at war across the border. The first betrothal collapsed, and the dowry payments that had been made were demanded back, and the princess, who had been promised to one prince of the north, was now considered for another, for there was a second possibility, a duke of that northern house. The brother of the King of Scots, who had quarrelled with his royal brother and fled to England seeking support. To bind this useful exile to the English cause, a new marriage was proposed between Cecily and the rebel duke. and for a time she was promised to him instead. Her marriage once again a counter in the game of politics, arranged now to serve a different scheme. This second match, like the first, was sealed by a formal treaty with all the weight of state behind it. And this second match, like the first, came to nothing, for the schemes it served fell apart, and the rebel duke's cause failed. And Cecily was left once more unmarried, her hand promised and unpromised, a princess whose fate shifted with every turn of her father's policy. Twice now she had been betrothed, and twice the betrothal had dissolved, and she was still unwed, still waiting, while the great men disposed of her future, and then disposed of it again. There is something poignant in this, when we pause to consider it, in the spectacle of a girl whose whole fate was bartered back and forth in the councils of kings, with no more say in the matter than a jewel passed from hand to hand. This was the common lot of royal daughters in that age, of course. They were born to be used, to be married where their father's interests directed, to leave their homes and their families, and go to live among strangers for the sake of a treaty or an alliance. Cecily would have known from her earliest understanding that this was her destiny, that she would not choose her own husband, but would be given to whatever man the politics of the moment required. And yet there is a peculiar cruelty in the way her early betrothals were made and broken, promised and withdrawn, so that she grew toward womanhood with nothing settled at all, her marriage forever under negotiation, forever falling through. We do not know what she felt about it, for no record of her girlhood thoughts survives, but we may imagine that it bred in her a certain wariness, a certain understanding of how little her own wishes counted in the reckonings of the powerful. And perhaps, far in the future, when she at last did something for no reason but her own desire, married a man for no reason but love, there was in that act some echo of these early years, some long-delayed assertion of a self that had been bartered and bargained over since before she could remember. But that lay decades ahead. For now, she was simply a princess whose marriages would not hold, waiting to see where she would be sent. We might pause here to imagine what such a life felt like from the inside, for it is easy to recite the betrothals and the treaties and forget that at the heart of them was a living child, growing up with the knowledge that her own heart would never be consulted. From her earliest years, she would have understood that she was destined for a foreign court, that one day she would be packed off across the sea or over the border to marry a man she had never met and might never love, to live out her life among strangers speaking a strange tongue. The other girls of her acquaintance, the daughters of lords, faced much the same fate, of course, but for a princess the stakes were higher and the bargaining harsher. Her hand, a thing of such value that whole treaties might turn upon it. She would have been taught, no doubt, to think of this as her duty and her glory, the high calling of a king's daughter, and perhaps she did think of it so, for she knew no other way of being in the world. Yet somewhere beneath the training, in the private places of the heart that no record preserves, there must have lived a girl with her own wishes and her own dreams, who wondered, perhaps, what it might be like to choose, to love where she pleased rather than where she was sent. We cannot know whether such thoughts ever troubled her in those early years. But knowing what she would do in her final years, the one great act of self-will by which she is remembered, it is hard not to suspect that the wish to choose for herself was there all along, buried deep, waiting through the long decades for its moment to come. One question presses on these years, though the records will not answer it. What did Cecily herself make of it all? We have no diary of her girlhood, no letters in which she poured out her heart. Nothing but the dry treaties and account rolls that recorded her betrothals as matters of state. And so the inner life of the girl remains hidden from us, as the inner lives of most women of that age remain hidden, lost behind the official record that noted only what was done to them and never what they felt. But we may guess. A girl who is promised to one prince and then another, who hears the great men of her father's court discussing her future as they might discuss the sale of a manor or the terms of a loan, who knows that she will one day be sent away to a husband chosen entirely without reference to her wishes. Such a girl can hardly help but form some private view of her situation. Perhaps she accepted it without question, as the way of the world, the only fate she had ever known or imagined. Perhaps, in some corner of her heart, she resented it, chafed against it, dreamed of a life in which her own desires might count for something. We cannot know, but when we come, at the end of her story, to the extraordinary thing she finally did, the marriage she made for no reason but her own will, it is hard not to wonder whether the seed of that defiance was planted here, in these early years of being bartered and bargained over, when she learned again and again exactly how little her own heart was permitted to weigh. Then, when Cecily was 14 years old, the whole world she had known came crashing down. Her father, the king, still only in his early 40s, still seemingly in the prime of his strength, fell suddenly ill and died, with a swiftness that shocked the kingdom. One week he was the Golden King, master of his realm, and the next he was gone, leaving his throne to his elder son, the boy Edward, a child of 12. It was the worst thing that could have happened to the House of York, for a boy on the throne meant rule by others in his name, and that in turn meant a scramble for power among the great men of the realm. And that struggle, in the poisoned atmosphere of Edward's court, with the old nobility and the upstart Woodvilles at each other's throats, could only end in violence. And so it did. Within weeks of the old king's death, the realm was plunged into a crisis that would destroy Cecily's family. Her uncle Richard, the dead king's brother, the man who should have protected his nephews, instead seized power for himself. He took the young king into his keeping, arrested and executed the boy's Woodville relations, and then, in a move that stunned the country, declared that his brother's marriage had been invalid, that the children of it were illegitimate, and that the crown was therefore his by right. In a matter of weeks, Cecily had gone from being the daughter of a king and the sister of a king to being, in the eyes of the law her uncle had made, a bastard, the base-born child of an unlawful union. Stripped of her royal rank and her place in the succession, the summer that followed her father's death was the strangest and most terrible of Cecily's life, and it unfolded not as a single blow, but as a sequence of public spectacles, each one stranger than the last, by which her uncle climbed step by step toward the throne while the family looked on. It began with the show of order. Her elder brother, the boy Edward, was proclaimed king, and preparations were set in hand for his coronation, the city making ready to crown the second Edward of that name. The bells and the banners and the processions all being readied for a child king's anointing. The boy was brought toward London under the protection of Richard of Gloucester, who took upon himself the office of protector, the guardian of the realm during the king's minority, and for a brief space it seemed that the accustomed forms would hold, that a boy would be crowned, and a council would rule, and the House of York would go on. But beneath the show of order, the ground was already moving. The protector struck first at the Queen's kindred, the Woodville relations whose power he meant to break, seizing and imprisoning the men closest to the young king and dispatching them, before long, to their deaths without trial. The Queen, reading the danger, gathered her daughters and her younger son and fled once more into the sanctuary of the Abbey at Westminster, as she had fled before in the troubles of the past. And then came the public unmaking of the whole family's right. A sermon was preached at the open-air pulpit by the cathedral, before the assembled citizens, declaring that the dead king's marriage had been no true marriage at all, that he had been pledged to another woman before he ever wed the Queen, and that the children of the union were therefore base-born, no princes and princesses, but bastards with no claim to anything. It was a public branding, delivered from a pulpit to a crowd, and by it Cecily and all her brothers and sisters were stripped in an afternoon of the royal rank they had been born to, and held all their lives. What was preached was then enacted in law and in ceremony. The Lords and Commons were brought to petition the Protector to take the crown himself, as the only true and adult heir of the House of York, now that his brother's children were set aside. And he, with a show of reluctance, consented. Within days, the thing was done. The man who had come to London as the guardian of his nephew was crowned king in the abbey, anointed and enthroned with all the ancient solemnity. He and his wife, passing in procession through streets hung with cloth, the lords who had served the dead king now bending the knee to his brother. It was one of the swiftest and most complete revolutions the kingdom had ever seen. In the space of a single summer, the throne had passed from the dead king to his son, and from his son to his brother. And the children of the elder line had been cast down from the height of royalty to the disgrace of bastardy, their very legitimacy denied before the people. Through all of this, Cecily watched from within the walls of the sanctuary, where she sat shut up with her mother and her sisters, while the world outside was remade against them. She was 14, old enough to understand exactly what was happening, and powerless to do anything but witness it. She had seen her father carried to his grave. She had seen her brother proclaimed king. She had heard, no doubt, the dreadful news brought in from outside, the arrests, the executions, the sermon at the pulpit, the petition, the crowning. Each report must have come like a fresh wound, each one confirming that the House of York was not merely changing its head, but devouring its own, that the protector had become the supplanter, that the uncle had risen upon the ruin of the nephews. For a girl reared to think of her family as the summit of the world, to watch that family turn upon itself and pull itself down, to be herself declared base-born by her own uncle's decree, was a thing to mark the soul forever. And the worst of the summer's horrors was still unfolding, even as the new king took his throne, for Cecily's two young brothers, the boy who had been proclaimed king and his little brother, were by now both lodged within the tower, and from there, that summer, they would pass out of all certain knowledge. The coronation that crowned the uncle was the same season that swallowed the nephews. So the public pageantry of Richard's accession, the anointing and the enthroning and the bending knees, ran on against a private darkness that no ceremony could cover, the silence gathering around two children in a riverside fortress, while their uncle was hailed as king. Cecily came out of that summer having lost, in the space of a few months, her father, her brothers, her royal name, and the whole settled order of her world. And having learned, at 14, the deepest lesson her violent age could teach, that there was no height so secure that ambition could not topple it, and no bond of blood so close that power would not break it. The speed of it must have been the cruelest part, for catastrophe came not slowly, giving time to prepare, but all at once, in a rush of days that turned the whole world upside down. In the spring her father had been alive, and the family secure at the summit of the realm. By the height of summer her father was dead, her eldest brother deposed, both her brothers vanished, her mother's kin executed, and Cecily herself declared base-born and cast out of the royal house. Weeks, not years, had wrought this ruin. One can hardly imagine the bewilderment of living through such a collapse, the ground giving way beneath one's feet, faster than the mind could follow, each day bringing news worse than the last. For a girl of 14, only lately a princess of England, with a future that seemed assured, to find herself in the space of a single summer, a fugitive and a bastard, her family destroyed and her uncle enthroned over its ruin, must have been a thing scarcely to be believed, even as it happened. and there was no safe place to stand, no certainty to cling to, for who could say what the man who had done all this might do next? Whether the daughters of the old king might not also be swept away if they proved inconvenient. They lived, that summer, in the shadow of a power that had already shown how far it would go, and they could not know how much further it might be willing to reach. The blow was catastrophic, and it fell hardest of all on Cecily's two young brothers, the princes. The elder boy, who had been king for only a few weeks, was deposed and declared illegitimate along with his sisters, and he and his little brother were placed within the Tower of London, that grim fortress on the river-bank, supposedly for their own protection, and there, that summer, the two boys vanished from sight. Their appearances grew rarer, and then ceased entirely, and no sure account of what had befallen them was ever given. They simply disappeared, the two young princes, into the silence of the tower, and what became of them has remained one of the great mysteries of history, argued over for 5 centuries and never resolved. The common belief, then and ever since, was that they had been killed, put quietly to death at their uncle's bidding, to clear away forever the rival claimants who stood between him and a secure throne. Whatever the truth, the boys were never seen again, and Cecily, who had grown up alongside them in the nursery, lost both her little brothers in that terrible summer, swallowed up by the darkness of the tower. It is hard to imagine the grief and the terror of those months for the young princess, her father dead, her brothers vanished, her family scattered and destroyed, her own royal status stripped away, and her uncle, who had done all of this, seated now upon the throne. The golden world of her childhood had been utterly swept away, and Cecily, at 14, found herself a bastard and a fugitive in a realm ruled by the man who had ruined her house. It is easy, in reciting the fate of the princes in the tower, to forget that to Cecily they were not a famous mystery, but her own small brothers, the boys she had grown up beside, and that whatever the world would make of their disappearance, to her it was first of all a private grief. She had shared a nursery with them, she had watched them christened and carried and petted, the longed-for sons of the house, the pride and hope of her parents. The elder, Edward, the boy who would be king and then would not, was a child of grave promise, carefully reared for the throne he was never to keep. The younger, Richard, was the merry one, the spare, married off as an infant in a splendid ceremony to a little heiress, a bright child of the court. These were the brothers of her own table and her own blood, and in the terrible summer of her father's death, they were taken from her, not once, but by slow degrees, their appearances at the tower windows growing rarer, the sight of them ceasing, the silence closing over them, until at last there was no more to see. We do not know what Cecily was told, or what she believed. She was in sanctuary or newly out of it when the boys vanished from view, cut off from sure news, dependent on rumour, and rumour in that summer ran black. The common belief, then and ever after, was that the children had been quietly put to death, removed because they stood, base-born or not, between an anxious king and a secure throne. Whether Cecily heard this whispered while it was fresh, whether she clung instead to some hope that they yet lived, whether she went to her own grave, not knowing what had become of the brothers of her childhood, the record does not say. But this much we may be sure of, that she lost them in that summer, as surely as if she had seen them buried, and that she had not even the cold comfort of a grave to mourn at, nor a body to lay to rest, nor any certain word of how or when or why they had gone. They were simply there, and then they were not, and the not knowing was a wound that could never quite close. There is a particular cruelty in that kind of loss, the loss without an ending, and Cecily had it doubled, for both her brothers went into the same silence together. To lose a child of the family to sickness or accident is grief enough, but it is grief with a shape, a death and a burial and a place to bring one's sorrow. To have two brothers carried into a fortress and never to learn what was done to them there, to be left forever with the open question of it, the imagining of it, is a torment of another order. And it came to her wrapped in fear for herself. For if her uncle could make away with the sons of his dead brother, what surety had the daughters, the sisters, who had been declared bastards alongside the boys? That they too might not be found inconvenient one day and quietly removed. She mourned her brothers, we must suppose, in terror as much as in sorrow, the grief and the dread tangled together, the question of their fate doubling as a question about her own. Of the famous mystery itself, the centuries-long argument over who killed the princes and how and whether, there is little profit in our rehearsing here. For it has no end, and Cecily was no party to it. What concerns her story is not the solving of the riddle, but the living with it. The way that two empty places at the family's table became a permanent absence in her life. A sorrow she would carry through all her later years, through her marriages and her widowhoods and her own quiet ending. The bright nursery of her childhood, the band of brothers and sisters gathered in the golden years, had been broken first by the early death of her sister Mary, and then, far more terribly, by the vanishing of the two boys. And the family that had seemed so numerous and so secure was being thinned and scattered before she was well out of her girlhood. Of all the losses her long life of losses would bring her, this one perhaps lay deepest. The wound least spoken of and least healed. The two little brothers she had played beside, swallowed up in silence, never to be seen or certainly accounted for again. We may let that grief stand for a moment and then move gently on, as Cecily herself had to do. For the living cannot dwell forever among the lost, and her own life, whatever it had suffered, was very far from over. She was young still, and the wheel that had cast her family down would turn again, as it always did, lifting and dropping the great in their endless rotation. But she carried her brothers with her into whatever came next. The memory of them folded away somewhere private and deep, and it is right that we should remember, when we follow her into her later fortunes, that this poised and enduring woman had buried, before she was 16, more sorrow than most people meet in a lifetime, and had learned to carry it without complaint, in the silence that her age demanded of its women, and that her own nature seems to have made her own. What those weeks of sudden ruin felt like, for a girl of 14, we can only try to imagine, for she left no account of them. One season she was a king's daughter in a court of music and gold, her future a matter of crowns. The next she was huddled in a draughty chamber within the precincts of an abbey, listening for footsteps, not knowing whether the men who now ruled would let her family live in peace or move to destroy them. The change can hardly have seemed real at first. There is a particular bewilderment that comes when a settled world dissolves overnight, when the certainties one has always leaned upon simply vanish, and a young person finds that nothing is as it was and nothing can be relied upon. Cecily had grown up amid talk of the wars, had known in some abstract way that her family's grip on the crown was contested. But to live it, to feel the ground give way beneath her own feet, to lose her father and her brothers and her very name as a princess, all in the space of a few terrible months, was another thing entirely. She would carry that knowledge for the rest of her life, the memory of how swiftly and how completely everything could be taken away. And it may be that this memory, more than anything else, lay behind the choice she would make at the very end, when she reached at last for something that could not be bartered or confiscated by kings, the one possession that was truly her own, the love she chose for herself. For Cecily and her sisters and her mother, the months that followed were a time of fear and uncertainty, spent first in the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey, where the Queen had fled with her daughters when the crisis broke. Sanctuary was an ancient rite, a place of refuge where even a king could not lawfully seize those who sheltered there. And the dead king's widow and her daughters huddled within its walls, while the kingdom was remade around them, and the man who had destroyed their family settled himself upon the throne. It was a wretched existence, cramped and frightened and uncertain. The proud queen and her royal daughters reduced to refugees in a church, dependent on the protection of holy ground. How long they could remain there, what would become of them, whether the new king would release them or move against them, all of this was unknown, and they lived from day to day in dread. Eventually, after months of negotiation, Cecily's mother came to terms with the new king. She agreed to leave Sanctuary with her daughters and to accept the new order in exchange for promises of safety and provision. It was a bitter bargain. A submission to the man who had destroyed her family, but the Queen had little choice, for she could not remain in Sanctuary forever, and she had her daughters' futures to think of. So Cecily and her sisters emerged at last from their refuge. No longer princesses, but the bastard daughters of a dead king, to make what life they could in the realm their uncle now ruled. The place that sheltered them through that dreadful year deserves to be seen plainly. For the word sanctuary calls up something grander and gentler than the cramped reality the family endured. It was no quiet cloister of contemplation, but a crowded enclave, hard against the minster at Westminster. A precinct of buildings within the holy ground where the right of refuge held, and into one set of lodgings there the Dowager Queen crowded with her daughters and her household when the world turned against them. The right itself was an ancient and a curious thing, resting on the belief that consecrated ground stood outside the ordinary reach of the king's officers, that a fugitive who gained it could not lawfully be dragged out, that even an anointed king must bow, in this one matter, to the older authority of the church. So the abbey precinct became at once their stronghold and their cage, a place where no man could seize them and from which they dared not stir, safe and trapped in the same walls. The lodgings were narrow and comfortless after the painted chambers and the river barges of their former life. The women lived crowded together with what servants and goods they had been able to bring, the proud queen and her royal daughters reduced to suppliants on holy ground, their meals brought in, their days hemmed by the walls of the enclave, their nights, we may suppose, broken by fear and the unfamiliar nearness of one another in close quarters. Beyond the walls lay the church itself, and the round of the monks' devotions would have reached them through the year, the bells for the offices, the chanting of the hours, the slow turning of the church's day, going on indifferent to the terror of the family lodged at its skirts. It was a strange counterpoint, the serene machinery of monastic prayer running on beside the huddled dread of the hunted women, the changeless calm of the cloister, and the sharp present fear of people who did not know, from one week to the next, whether they would emerge to safety or to ruin. Worst of all, in such a confinement, was the not knowing, for sanctuary gave them refuge from arrest, but no shield against the imagination. They were cut off from sure news of the world that was being remade against them, fed on whatever rumour came in at the gate, and rumour in that black season carried only horror, the executions of their kinsmen, the sermon that branded them bastards, the crowning of the uncle, and threading through it all, the silence thickening around the two boys in the tower. To sit shut up in a few small rooms while one's whole family is undone outside, to be able to do nothing, change nothing, learn no certain word, only to wait and dread and to pray, is among the hardest trials a human soul can be set, and the women of York endured it not for days, but for the better part of a year, the months dragging by in their cramped quarters, while the new order hardened around them. How a girl of 14 came through such a year with her spirit unbroken is a question worth the asking, for the months in sanctuary fell upon Cecily at the very threshold of her womanhood, at an age when the mind is most open to lasting impressions. She had gone in a princess, the daughter of a reigning king with a future of crowns before her. She would come out a bastard and a dependent, her father dead, her brothers gone, her family's enemies enthroned. Whatever softness the cosseted nursery had left in her, that long confinement in the cold enclave must have burned away, leaving in its place something harder, warrior, more enduring, the temper of a survivor. She had learned, in the hardest school there is, exactly how completely the great may be cast down, how swiftly a palace may give way to a hiding place, and a princess to a fugitive, and she had learned, too, the patience of those who can do nothing but wait. It was a bitter education, but it was thorough, and it forged the woman who would meet every later reversal of her turning life with the same unshaken composure, having survived at 14 the loss of very nearly everything. When the long confinement ended at last, it ended not in rescue, but in a hard bargain struck with the enemy, the only road out of the trap. And Cecily stepped back into the daylight, a changed creature, stripped of her rank, yet hardened in her spirit, carrying out of that cramped enclave the temper that would see her through every later storm. The precinct had kept her alive through the worst of the tempest. What it had made of her, the watchful and enduring woman who could meet any reversal without flinching, would be the whole secret of her survival in the long and turning years to come. In the strange new world her uncle had made, Cecily found herself married for the first time, though it was a marriage that would leave little trace and less happiness. The king, her uncle, had reason to wish her safely bestowed. For an unmarried niece of the blood royal, even a niece he had declared a bastard, was a piece that his enemies might wish to use. Far away across the sea, the exiled head of the rival house, a young man named Henry Tudor, with a thin claim to the throne, had publicly vowed to marry Cecily's eldest sister Elizabeth, and so unite the warring houses and rally all the king's enemies to his banner. If Elizabeth was the chief prize in that scheme, then Cecily was the next in line, the spare, the sister, who might serve the same purpose if the first plan failed, and so the king moved to put her beyond the reach of his enemies. By marrying her to a man of his own choosing, a loyal supporter of no great rank, so that she could not be raised as a figurehead against him. The man chosen was named Ralph Scrope, a younger son of a northern family, a minor figure entirely dependent on royal favour, and to him Cecily was married, a king's daughter wedded to a small man to keep her safely out of the game. It was a marriage of pure expediency, made to neutralise her, and it can have meant little to either party. We know almost nothing of it, for it left scarcely a mark on the record, and it would soon be swept away entirely by the great upheaval that was coming. But for a brief time Cecily, the king's daughter, was the wife of an obscure northern gentleman, married off by the king to keep her from becoming a danger to his throne. There is a pathos in that first marriage of hers, brief and loveless as it was, for it shows how completely she was a thing to be used in the eyes of those who ruled her. Ralph Scrope was no villain. He was simply a convenient instrument, a loyal man of modest standing, onto whom an inconvenient princess could be fastened to keep her out of mischief. And she was no bride in any meaningful sense. She was a problem to be managed, a piece of dynastic risk to be neutralized by being tied to a man too unimportant to make her dangerous. No one asked what she wanted. No one considered whether she and this northern gentleman might suit one another, might build some affection, might make a life. The marriage existed for one purpose only, to remove her from the game. And once that purpose was served, it would be discarded as casually as it had been made. We do not even know whether the two of them lived together as man and wife, or whether the marriage was a thing of parchment only. a legal fact with no human substance behind it. What we know is that it left no mark on either of them that the records preserve, that it was made for cold reasons and unmade for cold reasons, and that Cecily passed through it as through a brief grey corridor between the bright disasters of her youth and whatever was to come. It was the lowest ebb of her fortunes, this marriage to an obscure man arranged by the uncle who had ruined her house. And it is a measure of how far the daughter of King Edward had fallen, that she could be disposed of so. There is something telling in that first marriage, brief and shadowy as it was, for it shows with perfect clarity the use to which a royal daughter could be put. Cecily was married not because anyone wished her happiness, not to advance her or to reward her, but simply to remove her as a threat, to take a dangerous piece off the board by tying it down. Her uncle feared that his enemies might seize upon her, might marry her to some rival, and use her royal blood to raise a claim against him, and so he forestalled them by marrying her himself, to a man so insignificant that no faction could make anything of the match. It was a purely defensive move, a neutralizing of an asset, and Cecily's own person, her feelings, her future, counted for nothing in it. She was handled like a weapon that one's enemy might steal, locked away in a marriage of no consequence, so that it could not be turned against its maker. We do not even know whether she and Ralph Scrope ever truly lived together as man and wife, whether the marriage was anything more than a legal form, a paper bond to spoil her value to others. Most likely it was little more than that. And when it had served its purpose, when the danger had passed with the fall of her uncle, it was dissolved as casually as it had been made, swept aside without ceremony, as though it had never been. A marriage made to imprison her, unmade to free her, and in neither the making nor the unmaking was Cecily herself ever consulted. It is a small episode, easily passed over, but it captures the whole condition of her early life. A woman done unto, never doing, moved about by others for purposes entirely their own. The great change came in August of the year 1485 on a midland field called Bosworth, where Cecily's uncle the king met the invading army of Henry Tudor and was defeated and killed. The exiled claimant who had vowed to marry Cecily's sister had landed at last, gathered an army, and brought the usurper to battle, and when the day was done, Richard lay dead, and Henry Tudor was King of England. It was the end of the House of York as a ruling dynasty, and the beginning of the Tudor age. And for Cecily and her sisters, it changed everything once again. The new king kept his vow. He married Cecily's eldest sister, Elizabeth, joining the rival houses of York and Lancaster in his own marriage. And he set about undoing the damage her uncle had done to her family. One of his first acts was to repeal the law that had declared the children of Edward IV illegitimate, so that Elizabeth, his bride, should be a king's true-born daughter and not a bastard. And in restoring Elizabeth's legitimacy, he restored that of all her siblings, Cecily among them. At a stroke, she was a princess again, the true-born daughter of a king and the sister of the new Queen of England, her rank given back to her after the years of disgrace. The wheel had turned once more, and the bastard fugitive of her uncle's reign was under her new brother-in-law a great lady of the realm again, second only to the Queen herself among the women of the new royal family. With her legitimacy restored, the marriage her uncle had forced upon her became an embarrassment to be undone. For it would not do for the sister of the Queen to remain wedded to an obscure northern gentleman of no rank. The marriage to Ralph Scrope was accordingly set aside, declared null, swept away as though it had never been. And Cecily was free once more, a princess of the blood, released from a union that had served its purpose and was now an inconvenience. Poor Ralph Scrope vanishes from her story at this point. His brief moment as the husband of a king's daughter ended. dismissed and forgotten, as the great ones rearranged Cecily's life to suit the new order. And Cecily, restored to her rank and freed from her unwanted husband, took her place at the centre of the new Tudor court, a prominent and honoured figure, the Queen's beautiful sister, with a fresh marriage surely to be arranged for her, one worthy this time of her royal blood. The years of disgrace were over. She was a princess again, at the heart of the court, and the future, which had looked so bleak in the dark days of sanctuary, seemed bright once more. Among the honours that came back to Cecily in the bright new reign, none spoke more plainly of her restored standing than the part she was given at the christening of the king's firstborn son. For to carry the infant heir to the font was a station reserved for the very closest of the royal kin. Her sister, the Queen, had been brought to bed of a boy in the early autumn, at the ancient city of Winchester, chosen for the birth because of its old association with the legendary kings of Britain, and the child was named Arthur, in deliberate evocation of that legend, the once and future king, whose name the new dynasty meant to make its own. The birth of a healthy son and heir was the surest possible seal upon the king's throne and upon the union of the rival houses in his marriage, and the christening was kept with a magnificence to match its meaning. The Cathedral of Winchester made ready to receive the heir of England at the font. It fell to her to bear the prince in the procession. The records of that day set her at the heart of the ceremony. The Queen's own sister, carrying the swaddled prince through the great church toward his baptism, surrounded by the lords and prelates and the blaze of the christening's pomp. To hold the future of the dynasty in her arms, the small living promise of the reconciled bloodlines. The boy in whom York and Lancaster were joined was a charge of the highest honour, and that it fell to Cecily marks how fully she had been received back into the bosom of the new royal family. The disgraced and bastardized girl of a few years before now walked in glory at the christening of the heir to the throne. That the prince held safe in her keeping, as the holy water was made ready, this ceremony would have unfolded with all the grave splendour the church and the crown could summon between them. The cathedral hung with rich cloths, the great silver font made ready, the procession moving in measured order through the nave, the godparents standing in their estate, the choir lifting the ancient chants while the candles burned against the autumn gloom. The infant prince, in his christening robes of cloth of gold, was carried to the font and baptized into the faith and into his great inheritance, given the name that bound him to the oldest legends of the island he was born to rule. About him stood the chief persons of the realm, and among them, bearing him or close beside him through the rite, was his Aunt Cecily, a figure of the first rank in the new order, doing honour to her sister's son. There is a quiet irony worth marking in the scene, for the boy Cecily carried to the font was the living symbol of her own family's defeat and absorption. He was the heir of the house that had pulled down the House of York, the son who would, had he lived, have reigned as the second king of the new line, and yet he was also her own blood, her sister's child, the grandson of her own father through the Queen. In him the two stories met, the fall of York and the rise of the new dynasty fused into a single small life. And it was a daughter of the conquered house who bore him in her arms toward his baptism. The arrangement captured perfectly the delicate position Cecily and her sisters occupied. The daughters of the old royalty made ornaments of the new, their blood now lending its lustre to the very throne that had supplanted them, honoured precisely because their honour proved the completeness of the reconciliation. The princess bore the prince, and in bearing him she carried too the whole strange settlement of her age, the folding of the beaten house into the household of the victors, made visible in the figure of an aunt bearing her nephew to the font. The child she carried that autumn day would not, in the end, outlive his youth. The bright hope of the christening would be cut short before it could ripen into the reign it promised, and the crown would pass instead to a younger brother whose name would ring down the centuries. But that sorrow lay far ahead, and on the day of the christening, all was promise and rejoicing, the heir safely born and safely baptized, the dynasty assured, the realm at peace. For Cecily, it was a day of high honour and, we may hope, of real joy, the chance to hold her sister's son and to take her place again, among the great, restored after all her sufferings to the very centre of the royal family. She had carried a queen's train, and she had borne a prince to the font. She stood once more exactly where her birth had set her. A princess of England, doing the offices of her blood, and the long fair noontide of her recovered fortunes was fully come. If we wish to fix the moment when Cecily's fortunes turned fully from disaster back towards splendour, we may find it in a single ceremony performed in the minster that had once been her family's refuge, when she walked behind her sister at her sister's crowning and carried the train of the new Queen of England. 2 years had passed since the field of Bosworth had killed her uncle and set a new king upon the throne. Her sister Elizabeth had been married to that king and had already borne him a son. And now, in the late autumn, the kingdom kept the high festival of the Queen's own coronation, the anointing and crowning of Elizabeth of York as Queen Consort of England. It was a deliberate and a glorious occasion, for the new king meant to honour the York blood that lent his throne its legitimacy, and the daughter of Edward was crowned with all the magnificence the realm could muster. And in the procession of that day, close behind the Queen, walked her sister Cecily, restored now to her rank, bearing the long train of the royal robe as it swept the abbey pavement. The symbolism of it would not have been lost on any who watched. Here were 2 daughters of the fallen house, the very girls who had huddled together as bastards in the sanctuary of this same abbey only a few years before, returned to it now in triumph, the elder to be crowned queen and the younger to attend her in honour. The same walls that had seen them at their lowest now saw them at their height. The wheel that had thrown the family down had carried it up again. And Cecily, who had walked out of these precincts, a disgraced and nameless girl, walked back into them a princess of the blood, second among the women of the new royal family, treading the measured pace of a great procession with her sister's train gathered in her hands. Few lives offer so sharp and so visible a turning, so exact a reversal of fortune, staged in the very place of the former ruin. The ceremony itself was a thing of overwhelming splendour, the kind of spectacle the age reserved for its most sacred occasions. The church would have blazed with light and colour, hung with rich cloths. Crowded with the lords and ladies of the realm in their robes of estate, the air heavy with incense and loud with the chanting of the choir and the blare of trumpets. The Queen was led in procession to her crowning, anointed with holy oil, vested in the robes of her dignity, and set upon the throne with the crown of England upon her head, while the assembled realm did her honour. To bear the train in such a procession was a station of high trust, given only to those of the closest blood, and that it fell to Cecily marks plainly her recovered place at the summit of the new order, the Queen's own sister. The chief of her attendants, restored to every honour her birth could claim. We may imagine, too, what private feelings moved beneath the ceremony for the 2 sisters, though no record preserves them. They had come together through everything, the golden childhood, the shared books, the terror of their father's death, the long fear of the sanctuary, the disgrace and the bastardy, and now this restoration to glory. Whatever distance their differing fortunes would later open between them, on that day they were simply 2 sisters who had survived, the one crowned and the other crowning her, bound by all they had endured together. For Cecily, the day must have held a complicated sweetness, joy at her sister's elevation and at her own recovered honour, mingled perhaps with the ache of all that could never be recovered, the dead father, the vanished brothers, the lost childhood, the bright family scattered and thinned. She bore the train of a queen, and the queen was her own beloved sister. And the minster that had hidden their shame now witnessed their triumph. And in that one image, the disgraced girl turned honoured princess. Walking in glory through the place of her former ruin, we may read the whole pattern of her astonishing, seesawing life. It would have seemed, to anyone watching the procession that day, that Cecily had come at last into a safe and settled eminence. And for a long span of years it was so. Standing again among the foremost ladies of the realm, close to the throne through her sister, the crowned queen, she had every prospect of a serene and brilliant maturity. The early sufferings behind her, and nothing but honour and consequence stretching ahead. She would grace the solemnities of the reign, attend upon the queen, take her appointed part in the ceremonies of the dynasty, and live, surely, in the comfortable dignity that her recovered station promised. The long noontide of her fortunes had fully arrived, the calm, broad middle of her life opening warm and bright before her, and the next great upheaval, when at last it came, would arise not from the cruelty of kings, but, astonishingly, from the wishes of her own heart. The new marriage, when it came, was a worthy one, a match befitting the sister of the Queen. The man chosen for her was John, Viscount Wells, a nobleman of Lancastrian blood and good standing, and significantly, a close kinsman of the new royal family, for he was a half-brother of the king's own mother. That formidable lady whose lifelong scheming had helped to put her son upon the throne. To marry Cecily to Viscount Wells was to bind the York princess to the heart of the new Tudor establishment, to knit together the old rival bloodlines in yet another union, and it was a match of real dignity and consequence. Wells was considerably older than Cecily, a man of middle years to her youth, but such differences in age were common enough in the marriages of that world, and the union seems, by the evidence that survives, to have been a genuinely happy one. The couple settled into their life together, dividing their time between the court and their own estates. Chief among them a fine castle in the flat fen country of Lincolnshire. And there Cecily passed some of the most contented years of her life, the mistress of her own household, wife to a kind and capable husband, secure at last after all the upheavals of her youth. For a woman whose early life had been so battered by the storms of politics, these years of quiet domestic happiness must have been precious indeed. A long calm after a turbulent dawn. The marriage to Viscount Wells brought her, for the first time in her storm-tossed life, a long stretch of settled peace, and much of it was passed not at the court, but in the flat watery country of Lincolnshire, where her husband's chief seat stood among the fens. The castle they are thought to have made their home was Tattershall, and a more striking house could hardly be imagined. A tower of warm red brick, rising sheer out of the level fenland, visible for miles across the wide flat fields. The finest brick building of its age in England, raised by a wealthy treasurer of an earlier generation to proclaim his consequence to the whole surrounding country. To come from the grey stone palaces of the Thames to this great rose-red tower in its moat, ringed by the immense skies and the standing water of the fen, was to enter a different England altogether, a land of dykes and drains and reed beds, of wildfowl rising in clouds off the Meares, of long horizons unbroken by any hill. It was a region with a beauty all its own, and Cecily had the leisure now to come to know it through the turning of the year. In summer the fens were a green and teeming world, the waters alive with fish and fowl, the air loud with birds, the reeds standing tall along the channels. In winter they were a stark grey expanse under enormous skies, the floods spreading wide and freezing, the wind coming unhindered across the levels with nothing to break it between the house and the distant sea. Within the brick tower all was warmth and comfort, the fires banked high against the fenland damp, The chambers hung and furnished as befitted a viscount and a princess, the household going about the unhurried business of a noble estate. Here Cecily lived as the mistress of her own house at last, ordering its affairs, keeping its hospitality, presiding over the round of its days, a settled married lady after all the upheavals of her girlhood. By every sign that reaches us, the marriage was a contented one, for all the difference in the partners' years. Wells was a man of middle age to Cecily's youth, a good 20 years her senior, a seasoned soldier and loyal servant of the crown who had risked his life for the new king and been rewarded with a viscountcy and the hand of the Queen's sister. Such a gap in age was nothing remarkable in the marriages of that world, where matches were made for blood and policy, and affection was expected to follow if it came at all. And in this case, by the evidence we have, it did come. The couple seemed to have suited one another, to have built between them the ordinary intimacy of a working marriage, sharing their time between the court and their country estates, between the ceremonies of the reign and the quiet rounds of Lincolnshire. For a woman whose early life had been a chronicle of loss and fear and helpless waiting, these years of domestic calm, of being a wife in her own household with a husband who valued her, must have been precious beyond reckoning. A haven such as she had never known. The running of a noble house was itself a full and demanding office, and Cecily, raised from infancy to exactly this work, would have taken it up as her proper sphere. A great estate was a small kingdom, with its lands and its tenants, its officers and its servants, its accounts and its provisioning, its endless hospitality to be kept. And the lady of the house held real authority within it, governing the household, overseeing its women, managing in her husband's absence the affairs of the whole establishment. This was the destiny all her schooling had fitted her for, the management of a great household. And though the household was a viscount rather than a king's, the skills were the same, and Cecily exercised them now in earnest. She had her embroidery and her devotions, her books and her music, the accomplishments of her girlhood carried into her wifehood. She had the seasons of the fen country turning outside her windows. She had, for the first time since her childhood, a home that was truly her own, and a life that had ceased for a while to be at the mercy of kings. We should linger on this calm, for it was the still centre of her turning life, the long peaceful noontide between the storms of her youth and the storms of her age. The girl who had lost everything in the terrible summer of her father's death, who had hidden in sanctuary and been married off to neutralize her, had come at last into a safe and honoured harbour, a princess restored, the sister of the Queen, the wife of a worthy lord, the mistress of a brick castle in the fens. Had her story ended here, it would have been the story of a royal daughter who suffered greatly in her youth and was rewarded at last with rank and peace. A satisfying enough shape for a life. But it did not end here. The peace of these Lincolnshire years was not to be her ending, but only her resting place. The calm before a final turning that no one who saw her then, the contented viscountess in her fenland tower, could possibly have foreseen. For now, though, she was at peace, and we may leave her so for a moment in the warmth of the brick house under the wide fen sky, in the best and most untroubled years that her difficult life would ever grant her. Cecily was not the only daughter of King Edward to be settled and bestowed in these years, for the whole surviving band of York sisters came, one by one, to their various fortunes, and it is worth following them a little way, for their lives form the chorus to Cecily's own, and show how differently the same inheritance could fall out. They had been a numerous sisterhood in the nursery. Death had already thinned them, taking Mary in her girlhood and others in infancy. But several lived to womanhood and to marriages of their own, and through them the blood of Edward IV ran on into the noble houses of the realm. The eldest, Elizabeth, had climbed highest of all to the throne itself, Queen of England and mother of the new line, the dazzling exception among them. The rest were married more modestly, as the king saw fit, into the powerful families whose loyalty he wished to bind, their royal blood a prize to be bestowed, where it would do the crown most good. There was Anne, younger than Cecily, who was given in marriage to a son of the mighty Howard family, a match that joined the York blood to one of the foremost of the noble houses, the line that would in time rise to a dukedom and play its part in the storms of the next reign. Anne's married life was passed in the orbit of that family, bearing the burdens and the dignities of a high noblewoman, though she too would know the sorrow of children who did not live, and would die while she was still far from old. Was Catherine, younger still, married to a nobleman of the West Country, a union that began in honour, but ran into trouble. For her husband fell under the king's deep suspicion in the matter of the pretenders and the plots that haunted the reign, and was shut up in prison for years, while Catherine endured the long anxiety of a wife whose husband lay under the shadow of the crown's distrust. She outlived him, and in her widowhood took a vow that she would not wed again, ending her days a lady of independent estate, the longest lived of all the sisters. And there was the youngest, Bridget, whose path led not to a marriage bed at all, but to the cloister, for she was given to religion and became a nun, professed in a house of devout women, where she passed her whole life in prayer and observance. It was no rare thing for a royal or noble family to dedicate one daughter to the church, an offering of a child to God, and a provision for a girl who need not then be dowered and married off. And Bridget, the last of Edward's daughters, lived out her years behind convent walls, far from the marriages and the courts and the dynastic reckonings that shaped her sisters' lives, a still point of the religious vocation amid the worldly fortunes of her house. Of all the daughters of York, she alone stepped wholly aside from the marriage board on which the rest were played, and found in the cloister a peace that the world could not disturb. Set side by side, the fortunes of the sisters make a kind of pattern, a spread of all the destinies open to a high-born woman of that age. One became a queen, one a nun, one married into a ducal house. One endured the long trial of a suspected husband. One, Cecily, after every honour, threw her rank away for love. They had begun together, the daughters of York, kneeling in a row in the painted glass, sharing the same nursery and the same catastrophe, and the wheel of their lives had scattered them across the whole range of a woman's possible fates, from the throne to the convent to the disgraced country marriage. In their differing ends, we may read how much and how little was settled by the blood they shared, all of them royal, all of them caught up in the same upheavals of their family's fortune, and yet each carried by the current to a wholly separate shore. It is against this company of sisters that Cecily's own choice stands out most sharply, for she alone among them broke the pattern entirely. Elizabeth took the crown that was offered her. Anne and Catherine took the husbands the king assigned them. Bridget took the veil that was laid out for her. Each of them, in her way, accepted the destiny her family and her king ordained, and lived it out as a royal daughter was expected to. Cecily, and Cecily only, refused the part written for her and wrote her own instead. Setting aside the suitable match the crown would have made for her in favour of a man of her own choosing, beneath her in everything but his hold upon her heart. Among 5 sisters, who between them ran the whole gamut of obedient royal womanhood, she was the one who stepped off the board, and it is this that makes her, of all the daughters of Edward, the one whose story most surprises and most moves us. At the Tudor court, meanwhile, Cecily was a figure of the first importance, the Queen's own sister, and she played a prominent part in the high ceremonies of the new reign. In the years of her restoration, she was a constant presence about the throne, taking part in its festivals and its solemnities, walking in its processions, attending upon her sister the Queen, called upon again and again to do the honours that only the closest of the royal kin could do. She was, in these years, exactly what a king's daughter and a queen's sister was meant to be: an ornament of the court, a participant in its supreme occasions, a princess of the blood moving through a world of ceremony and magnificence. Her early sufferings behind her, her position secure. To all appearances she had come at last into a safe harbour, honoured and settled, her place in the world assured by her royal blood and her good marriage and her closeness to the Queen. The position Cecily held through these middle years was, for all its honour, a delicate and even a dangerous one, and it is worth understanding the quiet strain that ran beneath the splendour, for she lived her whole adult life as a daughter of a deposed dynasty under the crown that had deposed it. The king, her brother-in-law, had won his throne by the destruction of her house. His claim, thin in itself, rested in large part upon his marriage to her sister and upon the careful folding of the York blood into his new line. Cecily and her sisters were the living proof of that reconciliation, paraded at the christenings and the weddings and the coronations as evidence that the old wound was healed. The daughters of the conquered house made gracious ornaments of the conqueror's court. It was a clever arrangement and a comfortable one, so long as all went smoothly. But it rested upon a suppressed truth that could never be wholly forgotten: that the crown the king wore had been her own family's crown, and that her veins carried a claim older, and by the elder reckoning, better than his own. The danger in this was not Cecily's own ambition, for she shows no sign of ever having nursed any, but the use that others might make of her blood. Throughout these years, the new king was haunted by pretenders, by young men set up by his enemies who claimed to be one or another of the lost York princes, miraculously escaped from the Tower, or some other scion of the fallen house, raised as figureheads to rally the disaffected and to challenge the throne. More than one such phantom troubled the reign, gathering support abroad, landing with rebel armies, keeping the king in a state of watchful suspicion of anyone in whom the old blood ran. In such a climate, to be a genuine daughter of King Edward, a true Princess of York, was to be perpetually under a faint shadow of distrust, however loyal one's conduct, simply because one's very existence was a reminder of the line the king had supplanted and a possible rallying point for his foes. The York women were honoured, but they were also watched. Cecily seems to have carried this delicate burden with a composure that never failed her, asking for nothing, threatening nothing, playing to perfection the part of the loyal sister of the Queen. Whatever private grief she may have nursed for her vanished brothers, whatever buried sense that the throne had been her family's, she kept it wholly to herself, giving the king no cause for complaint, taking her appointed place in his ceremonies, doing the offices her blood required without a murmur of the resentment she might so understandably have felt. She had learned, in the brutal school of her youth, the supreme survival skill of her age and her sex, how to bend before power, how to accept the world as it was and make her place in it, how to keep her own counsel and show a serene face, whatever stirred beneath. It was the hard-won wisdom of a woman who had seen, more closely than almost anyone alive, what befell those who could not or would not bend, and she brought it to her years at the court, where she flourished, to all appearances, as untroubled as if her own house had never reigned. And yet we should not mistake this composure for contentment, nor imagine that the strain left no mark. To live one's whole life as a guest in what had been one's own father's house, to smile at the ceremonies of the dynasty that had destroyed one's brothers, to be valued precisely because one's submission proved the completeness of the conquest, must have asked a constant quiet discipline of the soul, a perpetual setting aside of feelings that could find no safe expression. Cecily managed it for the better part of 2 decades, the model of a reconciled princess. But it may be that the long suppression told upon her in the end, that the discipline of those years of careful, watchful, self-effacing service built up in her, unseen, a longing for something that was simply and only her own, untouched by policy and beyond the reach of the crown's calculation. When at last she did break free, when she made the one choice of her whole life that served no interest but her own desire, it may be that she was reaching, after all those years of bending, for the one thing that being a York princess at a Tudor court had never allowed her, a corner of her existence that belonged to nobody but herself. The unease that shadowed the York blood through these years was no mere private feeling of Cecily's. It broke out, more than once, into open danger to the crown, for the reign was troubled from its early days by a procession of pretenders. Impostors raised up to claim the throne in the name of the fallen house, and the existence of such challenges cast a long shadow over every member of the old royal family. The first of them appeared while the new king's seat was barely warm. A boy was put forward, coached and presented by the king's enemies, who claimed to be one of the imprisoned heirs of York, the young Earl of Warwick, son of the king's executed brother, smuggled out of captivity and come to claim his right. The imposture gathered alarming force. The boy was carried over to Ireland, ever a nursery of York sympathy, and there, in the city of Dublin, he was crowned in earnest by the disaffected lords. A rival sovereign set up against the man in London. The matter came to its head in battle. An army was raised in the pretender's name, stiffened with foreign mercenaries and Irish levies, and it crossed into England and met the royal forces in the field, in a hard-fought engagement that was very nearly the undoing of the new dynasty before it was well begun. The king prevailed, the rebel host was broken, its leaders killed, and the boy who had been crowned in Dublin was taken alive. In a stroke of contemptuous mercy that tells us much about that cold royal confidence, the impostor was not put to death, but set to work in the royal kitchens as a turnspit, the crowned pretender reduced to a scullion, a living jest at the expense of those who had raised him. It was a shrewd humiliation, worth more to the king than a martyr's execution. But the ease with which a coached boy had drawn an army into the field was a sharp reminder of how much smouldering loyalty to the old house still lay about the kingdom, ready to be kindled. A second and more dangerous phantom soon followed, and this one struck nearer to Cecily's own heart, for he claimed to be no cousin but her very brother. A young man arose, polished and plausible, who gave himself out to be the younger of the two boys who had vanished into the Tower, Richard, Duke of York, declaring that he had been spared the death meted out to his brother and spirited away to grow up in secret abroad, and that he now returned to claim the throne that was his by right. For years this pretender troubled the reign, welcomed at foreign courts, acknowledged by some of the crowned heads of Europe, sheltered and promoted by the king's enemies, even by Cecily's own aunt, the Dowager Duchess in the Low Countries, who embraced him as her long-lost nephew. He gathered support, attempted landings, raised the spectre of a York restoration again and again, until at last he too was taken, and after a spell of captivity and a failed escape was hanged, and the long imposture ended on the gallows. We can only guess what it was to Cecily to live through these years, to hear a stranger claim the name and the face of the little brother she had lost, to know that somewhere a young man was walking the courts of Europe, calling himself the Duke of York. If she believed, as most did, that her brothers were long dead, then the pretender was a ghoul wearing her brother's name, a cruel mockery of her grief, to be repudiated and abhorred. And yet there must have been, beneath the loyal repudiation she was bound to show, some flicker of the unanswerable question, the question that hung over her whole life. For she did not know, none of them knew for certain, what had become of the boys in the Tower, and so she could not be wholly and perfectly sure that the man on the scaffold was an impostor and not, against all likelihood, the brother she had mourned. The pretenders fed upon precisely that uncertainty, the open wound of the prince's fate, and Cecily, who carried that wound more privately and more deeply than anyone, had to watch it reopened and exploited and paraded through the politics of the realm year after year, while she kept her composure and her silence, and gave the king no cause to doubt her. What all of this meant for her and for her sisters was that they lived their whole lives under a faint, ineradicable suspicion, honoured at court and watched in the same breath, valued for their reconciling blood and feared for it in equal measure. The pretenders made plain what was always true beneath the surface, that the daughters of Edward were walking reminders of a deposed line, possible figureheads, whether they wished it or not. Their very names a danger, that Cecily came through it all without ever once being accused of disloyalty, without ever giving the suspicious king the least true ground for complaint, is a quiet testament to the discipline she had learned in the hard school of her youth. She had seen what befell those who reached for crowns. She wanted no part of any of it, and she kept herself so studiously clear of every plot and pretender that even in that climate of fear she was never seriously suspected. It was, perhaps, the hardest performance of her life, this long maintenance of perfect loyalty under perpetual suspicion, and she sustained it for as long as the king lived, asking nothing, claiming nothing, until the day she claimed, at last, the one thing that was wholly her own. The peace of her Lincolnshire years did not last, and when it broke utterly, for in the space of a very short time, Cecily lost not only her husband, but the children she had borne him, so that the contented Viscountess of the Fenland Tower found herself, before she was much past 30, stripped of her whole little family at a stroke. She and Wells had been blessed with children, 2 daughters, named Elizabeth and Anne. But neither girl was to live to womanhood. They died young, as so terribly many children of that age died, carried off by the fevers and fluxes and sudden sicknesses that no physician of the time could cure before they could grow up, or marry, or carry their mother's blood forward into another generation. Whatever hope Cecily had built upon her daughters, whatever future she had imagined for them, all of it was extinguished in their early deaths, and the brick castle that had rung, perhaps, with the voices of 2 little girls, fell silent of them. We know almost nothing of these daughters beyond their names and their early ends, for they died too young to leave any mark upon the records, save the bare fact of their having been. But we need know no more to feel the weight of their loss upon their mother. To bury a child is among the heaviest griefs a human being can be asked to bear, and to bury both one's children, the whole fruit of a marriage, leaving the cradle empty and the line ended, is a sorrow that hardly bears imagining. Cecily had known loss before, in full measure. The death of her sister Mary in her girlhood, the vanishing of her brothers, the deaths of her father and, by now, her mother. But the loss of her own daughters was a grief of a different and a more intimate kind, the grief of a mother for the children of her own body, and it fell upon her in these years, along with the loss of the husband who might have shared and softened it. For her husband, too, was taken from her in this same dark season. Viscount Wells fell ill and died, in the closing years of the century, leaving Cecily a widow while she was still a relatively young woman, barely past her 30th year. The marriage that had given her the longest peace of her life was ended. The partner of her Fenland years was gone, and with her daughters already dead before him, she was left alone in the world, a childless widow, her little family wholly swept away. The man had provided for her, well, leaving her a life interest in his lands, so that she was not left poor. She was a wealthy widow, a princess of the blood, the sister of the queen, with every worldly comfort about her. But the house was empty of those she had loved, and the comfort was the cold comfort of possessions. and Cecily, who had built in Lincolnshire the one settled happiness of her difficult life, saw that happiness dismantled piece by piece until nothing of it remained but herself, alone, in the silence where her husband and her children had been. It is hard not to pause over the sheer accumulation of grief in this woman's life. The way that loss seemed to seek her out at every stage, taking from her, one after another, very nearly everyone she was given to love. As a child, she lost a sister. As a girl, she lost her father and her brothers and her royal name. As a young wife, by her uncle's reckoning, she had been a tool and not a bride. And now, in the years that should have been the secure middle of her life, she lost her husband and both her daughters together and was left as solitary as she had ever been. A weaker spirit might well have been broken by it, might have sunk into bitterness or despair, might have turned her face to the wall. But Cecily, by every sign, did not break. She had been schooled in endurance from her earliest years, had learned to absorb blow after blow and keep her feet, and she absorbed this one too, the heaviest perhaps of all, and went on living. What she would make of the life that was left to her, the choice she shaped out of her loneliness and her freedom, was to be the final turning of her story, the boldest and most surprising thing she ever did. But there was one bright moment of her old glory still to come before she made it. Before we follow Cecily into the great choice that would undo her honours, we should see her one last time at the very summit of her court life, taking a place of high distinction at the most glittering wedding of the reign. For in this same season of her widowhood, she was called upon to do honour at the marriage of the heir of England to a princess of Spain. The boy she had carried to the font at Winchester had grown to the threshold of manhood, and a bride had been sought for him from the farthest of the great courts of Christendom, the daughter of the joined crowns of Spain. A princess named Catherine, brought across the sea to be the wife of Prince Arthur, and in the fullness of time, the Queen of England. The marriage was the crown of the king's diplomacy, the binding of his new dynasty to one of the mightiest royal houses of Europe, and it was celebrated in the autumn of the year 1501, with a magnificence London had not seen in living memory. The Spanish princess made her entry into the city through streets transformed for her coming, and the whole capital put on a show such as it kept for only the rarest occasions. Pageants were raised at the conduits and crossings, great wooden stages worked with painted figures and allegories and personages out of scripture and legend, each one devised to greet the bride with verses and spectacle as she passed. The conduits were made to run with wine. The citizens turned out in their thousands, the guilds in their liveries, the streets hung with tapestry and cloth, the whole city given over to celebration. Catherine rode through it all to be married at the Cathedral of St. Paul, where a high platform had been raised the length of the church so that the multitude might see the joining of the prince and the princess, the two young people, scarcely more than children, made man and wife before the assembled realm in a blaze of ceremony. And in the train of the bride, among the great ladies who attended the Spanish princess at her wedding, walked the widowed sister of the late queen. To her fell the honour of bearing Catherine's train, just as she had borne her own sisters at the coronation years before, walking behind the bride in the procession with the long train gathered in her hands. One of the chief women of the realm doing service at the marriage of the heir. It was a place of real distinction given to a lady of the closest royal blood, and it shows that Cecily, even as a widow, even in these later years, still stood high in the honour of the court, still took her part in its supreme occasions. She had carried the groom to his christening as an infant. Now, 15 years on, she carried the train of his bride. The two services framed the whole bright arc of her court life. The aunt attending the nephew from his baptism to his wedding, a princess of the old blood gracing the great moments of the new dynasty. There is a poignancy in this last glimpse of Cecily in her glory, for it stood so near the end of it. Within a few months, the young prince whose wedding she had graced would be dead, carried off by sickness in the first spring of his marriage, the bright hope of the dynasty extinguished as suddenly as it had risen, and his Spanish bride left a widow at 16, to begin the long strange tale of her own that would one day shake the kingdom to its foundations. And within a year or two of that, Cecily herself would make the choice that flung her out of this shining world for good. So this wedding, this dazzling autumn pageant, with the king's sister-in-law walking honoured in the bride's train, was very nearly the last time she would be seen at the height of the court. The final flowering of the position her birth had given her before she set it aside with her own hands. She is at the peak here, in the great church among the great ones, bearing the train of a future queen. And from this peak, the ground falls away on every side. We do not know what was already stirring in her as she walked in that procession, whether the man she would shortly marry was already known to her, already loved, whether even as she did honour at this most royal of weddings, she was nursing a resolve that would carry her clean out of the royal world. It is tempting to imagine her there in the cathedral, outwardly the perfect princess, attending the perfect dynastic match, inwardly turning over a choice of an entirely different kind, the choice to marry not for crowns or alliances, but for herself. Whether the thought was yet formed in her, we cannot say. But the contrast is too sharp to pass over. The woman bearing the train at this supreme arrangement of dynastic marriage would, within a short space, make a marriage that was the very opposite of everything this one stood for. A match of no policy and no advantage and no grandeur whatever, made for nothing but the wish of her own heart. She walks here in the bride's train, honouring the rules of her world to the last. And then she will break them. What she did, in her widowhood, was to fall in love and to marry the man she loved, and the man she loved was nobody at all. He was a gentleman of Lincolnshire, named Thomas Kimby, a man of no rank and no fortune and no importance, an ordinary country esquire entirely beneath the notice of the great world in which Cecily moved. By every rule and expectation of her station, he was an utterly impossible match for a king's daughter and a queen's sister. A princess of the blood did not marry a simple country gentleman. Her marriages were affairs of state, arranged by kings to serve the interests of the crown, and her hand was far too valuable a thing to be given away for so trivial a reason as love. But that is exactly what Cecily did. Without the king's permission, without the blessing of her family, without any regard for the vast gulf of rank that separated her from the man she had chosen, she married Thomas Kimby, the obscure Lincolnshire esquire, for no reason anyone could see, but that she wished to. After a lifetime of having her marriages arranged and rearranged by others, of being a piece moved about the board in the games of kings, she had at last made a marriage of her own choosing, and she had chosen, of all things, a nobody, a man who could bring her nothing but himself. To understand the magnitude of what she did next, we must understand exactly what the rules were that she broke, for the marriage of a king's daughter or a queen's sister was very far from a private matter to be settled by the wishes of the lady herself. A woman of Cecily's rank did not own her own hand. Her marriage was the property, in effect, of the crown, a valuable asset of state to be bestowed by the king for the advantage of his policy, and a widow of her standing could no more choose her own second husband than a maiden could choose her first. The king held the disposal of her, and any marriage she might make without his leave was not merely a breach of manners, but an offence against the rights of the crown itself, an appropriation of a thing that was held to belong to the sovereign. This was the iron frame within which all the marriages of the royal kindred were made, and Cecily had lived her whole life inside it, betrothed and married and unmarried at the will of others, since before she could remember. What made the offence greater still, in the eyes of her world, was the man she chose, for it was not as though she had married some other lord, some figure of rank whose only fault was that the king had not picked him. She married beneath her, and not a little beneath her, but immeasurably so, choosing a country gentleman of Lincolnshire named Thomas Kyme, an obscure esquire of the minor gentry, a man so far below her in station that the match seemed, to those who looked on, very nearly an act of madness. A princess of the blood, the daughter of one king, and the sister-in-law of another, the widow of a viscount, allying herself with a plain country squire who could bring her neither rank nor wealth nor any advantage that the world could see. It was, in the cold reckoning of that hierarchical age, a thing almost beyond comprehension, a deliberate stepping down from the very summit of society to its respectable middle, made for no reason that policy could name. And there, of course, lies the whole point. For the reason was not one that policy could name. The only explanation that her own age could find, and the only one that history has been able to find since, is that she married him because she loved him, because she wished to, because after a lifetime of having her marriages made for her by others, she had resolved, at last, to make one for herself, and to make it on the one ground that her whole life had taught her to discount, the ground of her own heart's desire. The very obscurity of Thomas Kyme is the proof of it. Had she wanted rank, she could have had a lord. Had she wanted wealth, she could have had a rich man. The king would gladly have arranged some suitable match for the queen's sister, that she chose instead a nobody. A man who could give her nothing but himself is the surest sign that it was himself she wanted, that this was a marriage of pure affection, the one purely personal act of a life that had been, until then, the plaything of public considerations. We should weigh, too, the courage that such a choice required, for Cecily was no green girl swept off her feet by a first passion, but a woman of mature years who had seen the full weight of royal anger fall upon those who crossed it. She knew, none better, what the powerful could do to those who defied them. She had watched her own family destroyed by the brutal politics of the crown. She had spent her whole life learning to bend before exactly the kind of authority she now proposed to flout. She cannot have imagined that the king would smile upon her marriage. She must have known when she made her choice that it would cost her dearly, that she was setting at hazard her place at court, her favour with the crown, a great part of the fortune her second husband had left her. And she made the choice anyway, with her eyes open, accepting the price before she knew its full extent. That is not the recklessness of passion. It is the deliberate courage of a woman who has decided that one thing, at last, is worth more to her than everything else, and who is prepared to pay whatever is asked for it. There is a steadiness in that deliberate acceptance of the cost which is more impressive, in its way, than any rash romantic flight could be. This was no girl losing her head. It was a woman in her middle 30s who had buried more of her loved ones than most people ever know, weighing what little happiness might yet be hers against the certain displeasure of a vengeful crown, and deciding, with open eyes, that the happiness was worth the wreck. She knew the powerful do not forgive being defied. She had watched them at their work since she was a child, and knowing it, she went to her obscure Lincolnshire esquire all the same, and bound her life to his, and braced herself for the storm that her own age would send down upon her for it. That storm was not long in coming, for word of what she had done could not be kept from the man whose leave she had not asked, and the consequences, when they fell, would strip from her almost everything the world still reckoned worth. The king was furious. To Henry, the marriage was an outrage, a scandal, an act of reckless folly that demeaned the royal family and threw away a valuable dynastic asset for nothing. The sister of the queen had married, without leave, a man of no consequence whatever, a match so far beneath her that it seemed an affront to the dignity of the crown itself. And the king's anger had teeth, for he held the power to punish, and he meant to use it. It was a heavy price that hung over such a choice, and she must have known, when she made it, that she would have to pay it. She married Thomas Kimber anyway. Whatever else we may say of Cecily of York, she did not lack courage, nor the strength of her own desires, for she set at hazard the favour of the king, her place at the court, and a great part of her fortune, all for the sake of an obscure country gentleman whom she had chosen for herself. We come now to the hour toward which the whole of her story has been bending, the moment when the king learned what his sister-in-law had done, and the colour, we may be sure, changed in his face. No record preserves the scene itself. The exact manner in which the news was carried to him, whether by letter or by whispering courtier, whether Cecily faced him with it herself, or whether he heard it at second hand and sent for her after. The chroniclers did not trouble to set down the private fury of a king over the misalliance of a woman who no longer greatly mattered to his policy. But we know what the news was, and we know the man it came to, and we may picture the meeting of the two well enough, for it is the kind of scene that needs little invention to imagine. Picture, then, the king. He was a careful, cold, calculating man, this first of the new dynasty, a ruler who had clawed his way to the throne against long odds, and held it by unsleeping vigilance, suspicious by long habit of everyone about him, and most of all of any in whom the old York blood ran. He had taken the daughters of the fallen house into his family, and made what use of them his policy required, marrying the eldest himself and bestowing the others as suited him. And he had reckoned the Queen's sister Cecily a controlled and settled asset, a wealthy widow whose next marriage, when it came, he would arrange to his own advantage. To learn that she had married already, without his leave, without a word to him, and married not some lord he might have grumbled at, but an utter nobody, a Lincolnshire squire beneath the notice of the court, was to him an outrage on several counts at once, an affront to his authority, a squandering of a valuable royal asset, a humiliation of the dignity of his house, and beneath all of it, a fresh stirring of his perpetual unease about the York blood and what might be done with it beyond his control. And so the colour changed in his face, and the anger that was in him found its outlet in the only language a king truly speaks, the language of punishment. Cecily was cast out of the court that had been the centre of her world since her infancy, banished from the presence of the sister she loved and the only society she had ever known. The lands and revenues her second husband had left her, the comfortable fortune that was the foundation of her independence, were seized by the crown and stripped from her, so that the woman who had borne a queen's train and carried a prince to the font found herself in a single stroke disgraced, exiled, and a great part of her wealth taken away. All as the price of the man she had chosen. The king's anger had teeth, and it bit deep, and Cecily felt the full weight of the displeasure she must always have known her marriage would provoke. We may wonder what passed in her own breast as the blows fell, but here the record is as silent as ever, and we are left only with the eloquent fact of what she did not do. She did not repent. She did not put away her husband to win back the king's favour, did not plead that she had been deceived, did it not seek to undo what she had done. There is no sign anywhere that she tried to creep back into the warm centre she had been thrust out of. No record of any attempt to reverse her choice or to soften its consequences by abandoning the man for whom she had made it. She accounted the cost, it seems, before she ever paid it, and having paid it, she did not flinch, nor whine, nor look back. The princess who had spent her whole life submitting to the will of kings had, in this one matter, set her own will against the king's, and meant to hold it whatever the cost, and she held it to the end. And there was a deeper grief still to come upon her in this same dark season of her casting out. For while she stood thus disgraced, the sister who had been the dearest companion of her whole life was herself drawing toward her end. Kept now at a distance by the cloud of the king's displeasure, Cecily was no longer the honoured princess who could sit by a queen's sickbed. The estrangement her marriage had forced upon her would keep her from her sister at the very time she could least be spared. That parting, and the great public sorrow that followed it, deserves a place of its own, and we will come to it. For the moment it is enough to say that the price of her choice was still being counted out, blow upon blow, and that through all of it she did not repent. The death of the Queen, her sister, was kept with all the magnificence of public grief, and we should pause over that mourning, for it was the last occasion on which Cecily walked, however much under a cloud, in the ceremonies of the royal house she had been born to. Elizabeth had died in the Tower of London, in the depth of winter, worn out by a childbed that took her infant daughter after her within days, and her death struck the king and the kingdom with a force that the chroniclers struggled to convey. She had been the gentle heart of the reign, the York princess, whose marriage had healed the wars, beloved of the people in a way her guarded husband never was. And the realm mourned her with a depth of feeling that broke through the stiff forms of royal ceremony. The king himself, that cold and careful man, was said to have withdrawn into a private grief so violent that he would see no one, retiring alone to nurse a sorrow that astonished a court unused to seeing him feel anything at all. The obsequies were among the most splendid the age had seen. The dead queen's body, embalmed and robed, was laid in state, and over the coffin was set an effigy in her own likeness, crowned and sceptred, dressed in the robes of her estate, so lifelike that it seemed the queen herself lay there in her glory. Then the long procession wound through the streets of London, from the Tower toward the Abbey at Westminster, the way lit with torches and lined with mourners, the coffin drawn on its chariot behind horses in their black trappings, the effigy riding above it, the lords and ladies of the realm following in their hundreds, in the deep hooded black of mourning, the religious houses and the city companies turning out, the bells tolling across the capital. The whole city was hung with black and given over to sorrow, and the body of Elizabeth of York was borne to the abbey, where she had been crowned and married, to be laid at last among the kings. And in that long procession, somewhere among the mourning women who followed the queen to her rest, walked the disgraced princess herself. She came not where she should by rights have been hers, near the front, the chief of the dead queen's sisters. She came under the shadow of her disgrace, suffered to follow, but not to lead, present on sufferance, a fallen princess allowed to mourn, but not to shine. Yet she came, whatever the cost to her pride, whatever the awkwardness of walking disgraced among the honoured, she would not be kept from following her sister's body to the grave, and the crown, for all its anger, did not forbid her this last office of love. So the two sisters who had begun together in the nursery, who had signed their names side by side in their childhood books, who had once huddled together as bastards in the sanctuary of this very church, came to the abbey one final time. The one borne in her coffin beneath her crowned effigy, the other walking behind in the black of a disgraced mourner. The lifelong bond between them, holding even here, even now, even through the cloud of the king's displeasure. It is one of the most affecting images her whole story offers, this last walk of the sisters together, and it gathers up in a single scene the chief themes of Cecily's life. The love between the daughters of York that no reversal could break, the perpetual shadow of disgrace and suspicion under which she moved, and the unbending dignity with which she bore both her sorrow and her shame. She had lost by now very nearly everyone. Her father long ago, her brothers into silence, her first daughters in their childhood, her husband, her mother, and now the sister who had been the dearest companion of her whole existence. The one constant thread running through all the chances of her life. The nursery that had been so full was emptied, of all that bright company of York children kneeling in the painted glass. Cecily was now almost the last left standing, walking alone behind the coffin of the sister who had walked beside her through everything. She turned from the abbey when the long rites were done, back toward the obscure life she had chosen, the country husband and the quiet house far from the court, and she did not, so far as we know, return to the centre again. The death of Elizabeth severed her last living tie to the royal world. The sister who might have drawn her back, who had always been her advocate and her anchor, was gone. And there was nothing now to call Cecily home to the court, even had the king's anger softened. Her place in that world had depended, at the last, upon the love of the queen, and the queen was dead. So she went back to her chosen obscurity, a more solitary figure than she had ever been, carrying her griefs with her, in the silence that had become her element, and prepared, in her quiet country way, to live out whatever years remained to her in the life that she, alone of all her sisters, had dared to choose for herself. There was one person, however, who took pity on the disgraced princess, and it was, perhaps surprisingly, the king's own mother, the formidable old lady who had been the architect of so much of the Tudor triumph. She had known Cecily since the girl was an infant, had watched her grow up through all the upheavals of those years, and seems to have felt a real affection for her. Now, when Cecily was cast out and disgraced, it was the king's mother who interceded for her, who took the exiled couple under her protection, sheltering them at one of her own great houses, and who used her considerable influence with her son to soften his anger. Through her intercession, some part of Cecily's confiscated estates was eventually restored, and the worst of her disgrace was eased. It is a touching detail in the story, this kindness of the old Queen Mother toward the young woman who had thrown everything away for love, and it suggests that Cecily's choice, however it outraged the king, found at least some sympathy among those who knew her. The formidable matriarch who had schemed and fought to win a kingdom for her son could yet feel for a girl who had given up her place at court for the sake of her heart, and she used her power to shield her when the princess most needed shielding. That Cecily was not utterly crushed by the king's anger, that her disgrace was softened and a portion of her fortune in time restored. She owed almost wholly to one person, and that person, by a turn that may surprise us, was the king's own formidable mother, the Lady Margaret Beaufort, the small, devout, iron-willed matriarch whose lifelong scheming had helped to win the throne for her son, was as powerful a figure as any in the realm. And she had known Cecily since the girl was a child. The two had been bound by marriage as well as by long acquaintance, for Cecily's second husband, Viscount Wells, had been Margaret's own half-brother, which made the disgraced princess her sister-in-law of a kind, and whether for that reason, or out of long affection, or out of some fellow feeling of one strong woman for another, the old countess took the part of the exiled couple when no one else would. It was an act of real consequence, for Margaret's influence with her son was unmatched by anyone living, and she used it now on Cecily's behalf. She gave the disgraced pair the shelter of her own great houses, taking them under her protection at a time when the favour of the court was wholly closed to them. She reserved rooms for Cecily in her own residences, kept a place for her, would not let her be cast wholly into the cold. And she worked patiently and powerfully upon the king, until a settlement was at last devised that softened the worst of Cecily's punishment, an arrangement by which the princess surrendered some part of the disputed Wells lands, but was granted a life interest in the remainder, so that she and her husband should not be left destitute, should keep the revenues they had already drawn, should have enough to live upon in their retirement from the world. It was Margaret's doing, this rescue, the fruit of her standing and her perseverance and her willingness to spend her credit on a woman, the king would gladly have left to her ruin. There is something deeply touching in this alliance of the two women across the great divide of their family's quarrel. Margaret Beaufort was the architect of the house that had destroyed the House of York. Her whole life's work had been the raising of her son to the throne that Cecily's own father and brothers had held. By every logic of dynastic enmity, she should have been her adversary, the matriarch of the conquering line set against the daughter of the conquered. And yet, when Cecily fell, it was Margaret who caught her, Margaret who sheltered her, Margaret who pleaded her cause and won back her bread. The hard old schemer, who had fought so long and so ruthlessly for her son's crown, could yet feel for a younger woman who had thrown her own fortunes away for love and could move to protect her. And did. It is a reminder that the human heart is not bound by the logic of dynasties, that kindness can cross the deepest of divides, and that even in that harsh and calculating world, there was room for an old woman's mercy toward a younger one in trouble. Nor did Margaret's care for Cecily end with the settlement of her lands. To the very last, the old countess kept her place in the disgraced princess's life, reserving a chamber for her in one of her houses in the closing years, holding her still within the circle of her protection when the rest of the royal world had shut its doors. And when at length Cecily came to die, far from the court, in the obscurity she had chosen, it was Margaret Beaufort once more who reached out a hand, helping to meet the costs of the funeral of the woman who had given up so much for love. From the disgrace to the grave, the king's mother stood by her, the one steadfast figure of the court who did not abandon her. And it is no small part of Cecily's story that in her darkest passage she was not entirely friendless. That one powerful and unlikely ally remained constant to her when all the rest fell away. The princess who had wagered everything on her own heart did not lose quite everything after all. She kept her husband, for whom she had risked it, and she kept, in the old countess, one steadfast friend, the chief of the houses where the old countess held her state, and very likely one of those that gave the disgraced couple their shelter, was her favourite seat at Westminster in the rolling country of the Midlands. And it is worth picturing, for it shows the kind of haven into which Cecily was taken when the court shut its doors. Margaret had made of Westminster something remarkable, rebuilding and enlarging it into a residence of near-royal splendour, with its fine ranges of building and its gardens and its private galleries. A house from which she governed half the realm in her son's name and kept a court of her own that rivaled the king's for good order. Her household there ran by written ordinances of almost conventual strictness, every hour and office regulated, the whole establishment moving to the rhythm of its mistress's piety, the chapel busy from before dawn, the alms given out at the gate, the poor relieved, and the sick tended as a matter of settled policy. To come, a fallen woman, into such a house was to come under a powerful and a steadying wing, into a world of order and devotion and unhurried plenty, where the storms of the king's displeasure could not reach. And there, by the old countess's grace, the princess was given a refuge. A chamber was set by for her in the round of Margaret's residences, a room reserved for the Queen's sister in the houses of the King's mother, so that the woman the crown had cast out had still, somewhere, a door that opened to her and a hearth that was her own. It was no small mercy, in an age when disgrace meant the closing of every gate, to have one matriarch of unquestioned standing who would not turn her away, and Margaret, for all the iron of her statecraft, gave Cecily that constancy to the end. The kindness flowed, perhaps, from many springs at once, from the long acquaintance of the years, from the marriage tie through Viscount Wells, the Countess's own half-brother, and from something deeper still, the recognition of one resolute woman by another, the old schemer's grudging tenderness toward a younger one who had, after her own fashion, also defied the world to follow her will. Whatever its source, it endured, And Cecily, stripped of so much, kept this, a great lady's protection that did not fail. What manner of life she passed, in those last quiet years under that protection, we can reconstruct only in its broad outline. For she had stepped out of the lit stage of history into the shadowed wings where the records scarcely follow. But we know enough of the shape of a country gentlewoman's days to picture, in soft outline, the world she had chosen in exchange for the court. It was a world without ceremony, and that absence is the first thing to mark, for Cecily had been reared in a perpetual pageant, her every public hour shaped by ritual and procession and the watching eyes of 100 courtiers. Now all of that fell away. There were no trains to bear, no processions to walk, no solemnities to grace, no rank to keep in the strict order of precedence that had governed her since the cradle. In their place was the unhurried round of a private house, the plain dignified business of a manor in the shires, where the day was ordered not by the offices of state, but by the rising and the setting of the sun and the turning of the seasons over the fields. We may picture the texture of such days easily enough. A gentlewoman's house was a busy small commonwealth of its own, and its mistress was the heart of it. The still room with its preserves and its distilled waters and its simples for the sick. The dairy and the brewhouse and the kitchen with their ceaseless labour. The garden with its herbs and its fruit. The linen and the stores to be kept. The servants to be ordered. The table to be furnished. There was needlework by the fire in the long evenings. The same skill she had learned as a princess, now bent to the homelier work of a country house. There was the parish church on a Sunday, in lieu of the gilded chapel of a palace. The ordinary worship of an ordinary congregation, instead of the choirs and the incense of the royal chapel. There was the company of neighbours, the small society of the rural gentry, the visits and the hospitalities of a rank far below the one she had known, but warmer perhaps, and freer and entirely her own. And there was above all her husband, the plain man for whom she had given the rest of it up, the daily ordinary presence of the person she had chosen. This, in the end, was the whole point of the exchange she had made. Not the manor, or the still room, or the quiet of the country, but the man at the centre of it, the companionship she had reached for, against every rule of her station. We know little of Thomas Kyme. Not his face, nor his temper, nor the manner of their life together, and we cannot say whether the marriage brought her the happiness she had risked so much to find. But we know that she did not leave him, though leaving him would have been the road back to favour. We know that she stood by her choice through disgrace and confiscation, and the long withdrawal from the world she had been born to. And from that steadfastness we may fairly guess that she found in her chosen life something that the court, for all its splendour, had never given her. A woman does not throw away a kingdom's worth of consequence, and then hold to her bargain through every punishment, unless the bargain contains something she truly wants. There is a peculiar kind of freedom in obscurity, and it may be that she, of all people, was placed to taste it. She had lived at the very summit, where every eye was upon her, where her marriages were treaties and her movements were policy, and her very existence was a fact of state to be managed by kings. To step down from that height into the green anonymity of a rural manor was to lose much, but it was also to be released from much, to become, for the first time in her life, a private person, a woman whose days belonged to herself and not to the crown. No ambassador weighed her hand, no chronicler marked her comings and goings, no king reckoned what use might be made of her. She was simply the lady of a quiet house, the wife of a quiet man, living out her seasons far from the great affairs that had buffeted her since birth. After a lifetime of being a piece in other people's games, she had become, at last, merely herself. And we may hope that she found the smallness of it not a diminishment, but a release. It was not to be a long peace, for her years were already running toward their close, and she would not live to see old age in her chosen quiet. But however few the years it gave her, the life she had reached for was the one she lived out to the end, without retreat and without recantation. The husband at her side, the choice held. The court well lost. She had been a princess of England and the sister of a queen, and she chose to die a plain gentleman's wife, in a plain house, under a wide sky. And there is no evidence anywhere that she ever wished it otherwise. Of all the daughters of her royal house, she alone had taken her life into her own hands and spent it as she pleased. And whatever the cost of that, and the cost was steep, it was hers, freely chosen and freely paid. The one wholly self-determined act in the long obedient chronicle of a royal woman's days. And so Cecily passed her last years far from the court that had once been her world, living quietly with the husband she had chosen, in the obscurity she had accepted as the price of her love. We know little of those final years, for she had stepped out of the bright light of history into the shadows of private life, and the records grow thin. Later tales would give her children by Thomas Kimby, a son and a daughter. Though the truth of that is uncertain, and the surest accounts leave her childless at the last. What is sure is that she lived out her days far from the thrones and the crowns of her birth. She lived on into the early years of the new century, a king's daughter turned country gentlewoman, her royal blood now a thing of the past. Her days spent not in palaces, but in the quiet of a private household. Whether she was happy in those years we cannot certainly know, but there is no sign that she regretted her choice, no record of any attempt to return to the court or to undo what she had done. She had made her bed, as the saying goes, and by every indication she was content to lie in it, having gained, in exchange for all she gave up, the one thing she had never been permitted before. A life lived on her own terms, with a partner of her own choosing. Cecily of York died in the late summer of the year 1507, at the age of 38, still relatively young. Her days cut shorter than they might have been. She died far from the centre of things, in the quiet obscurity she had embraced, and her passing caused little stir in the great world she had left behind. The princess who had been betrothed to kings, who had once been pledged to a throne in the north and counted among the most sought-after brides in Europe, died at last as the wife of an unremarkable country gentleman, in a private station far below the one she had been born to. And yet there is one last touching detail, for it was the king's mother, the old queen mother, who had shown her kindness in her disgrace, who helped to pay for some part of her funeral, a final gesture of affection toward the woman who had given up so much for love. So Cecily was laid to rest, the king's daughter, who had wed a nobody, mourned by few, remembered by fewer, her remarkable story closed at last in the quiet she had chosen. What, then, are we to make of Cecily of York? This woman whose life ran through every turn of one of the most turbulent ages in English history. For the greater part of her years, she was precisely what her birth had made her. A piece on the board. A royal daughter whose hand was bartered and bargained over, betrothed and married and unmarried to serve the schemes of kings, with no more say in her own fate than any other princess of her age. Through the storms of her youth, she was carried helplessly along, declared a bastard and restored to royalty, sheltered in sanctuary and married off to neutralize her. Her whole existence, shaped by forces entirely beyond her control. In all of this, she was a victim of her times, a woman to whom things were done, swept along by the great currents of dynastic politics. But at the very end, in her widowhood, she did one thing that was entirely her own, one act of pure self-will that defied every expectation of her station. She married for love, and she paid the price for it, and she did not flinch. That single act transforms her in the eyes of history, from a mere pawn into a person, a woman who, having been disposed of by others all her days, finally disposed of herself and chose, against all the rules, the dictates of her own heart. And there is something quietly moving in that when we set it against the whole arc of her life. For here was a woman who had every reason to be cautious, who had seen, more closely than almost anyone, how dangerous it was to defy the powerful, whose own family had been destroyed by the brutal politics of the age. She had every reason to play it safe, to live out her widowhood in comfortable obscurity, to make the suitable second marriage that was expected of her, and never to risk the king's anger. And instead, she threw it all away. The favour of the crown, her place at the court, a great part of her fortune, for the sake of a country gentleman who could give her nothing but himself. It was not a wise choice, by any worldly reckoning. It was not a politic choice, nor a safe one. But it was hers, freely made, and in making it, she claimed for herself, however late and at whatever cost, the simple human right that her royal birth had always denied her, the right to choose whom she would love, and to live her days beside him. After a lifetime of being handed from one man's plans to another's, she gave herself away by her own will, and there, perhaps, lies the truest measure of her, and the thing for which she most deserves to be remembered. Before we leave her finally to her rest, set two images of her beside each other in the mind. There is the young Cecily of the bright dawn, the king's daughter in her father's glittering court, a princess of the blood, betrothed to a future king of Scots, her whole life a matter of treaties and crowns. One of the most marriageable young women in all of Europe, her future seemingly destined for a throne. And there is the other Cecily, of the quiet ending, the disgraced widow in her Lincolnshire obscurity, cast out from the court, stripped of her wealth, the wife of a simple country gentleman, living out her days, far from the world of her birth, having given up everything a princess was meant to hold dear. Both of these were the self-same woman, and the passage between the two images is her whole story. The princess made into a pawn, the pawn who turned, at the very end, into a free woman, choosing her own way at the cost of everything else. We may think her foolish, or we may think her brave, or we may, as is perhaps nearest the truth, think her both at once. But we can hardly fail to be moved by her, this king's daughter who wanted, in the end, only what the humblest of her father's subjects might have had, without a second thought, to marry the person she loved. And now we will let her be, there in the stillness of the quiet country house she had chosen. Every storm of her youth behind her, at last the court and its splendours surrendered. The crowns and the betrothals and the grand ceremonies all dimmed into the past where they belong. Let the glittering world of her birth dissolve gently into the dark, the palace by the river, the golden court of her father. The grand processions of the Tudor reign, all sinking softly down into the silence of the years long gone. Nothing remains now that can trouble her, no king to anger, no court to forfeit, no decision still hanging, for the one great decision of her life is taken and behind her, and she rests beside the man she chose. She wanted so little, in the end, and she paid so much for it, and she did not regret the bargain. Let her rest now, the king's daughter who married for love, in the quiet she gave up a kingdom's favour to find. Should these unhurried wanderings through the lives of people who loved and suffered so long ago be something you would care to seek out anew, you would be most welcome to subscribe, gently and with no urging from me. And another such evening will come your way in its own time. But that is a matter for the daylight. Just now, the night runs deep, and all that remains is to lay the day down and let sleep rise to meet you. It has been a soft and quiet pleasure to pass these dark hours beside you. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house. I will see you in the next one. Good night.